Hercule Poirot had always understood autumn. He understood it the way he understood human beings. Not through sentiment, but through careful attention to detail. The way a man's collar sits differently when he is carrying guilt. The way a woman's laugh arrives a half-second too late when she is frightened. These things, to Poirot, were as legible as headlines, as obvious as fingerprints left on clean glass. He was 53 years old in the autumn of 1934, and he had seen enough of human wickedness to fill several lifetimes. He had watched murderers weep with genuine grief at the funerals of their victims. He had held the hands of the innocent while they were led away in handcuffs, and he had watched the guilty sip their morning coffee without trembling. He had learned, over a career that had taken him from Belgium to London to the drawing rooms and country houses of England, that the human heart was not simply divided between good and evil. It was something far messier, far more sympathetic, far more dangerous. He was not a man who was easily surprised. And then the letter arrived. It came on an ordinary Tuesday, tucked between a tailor's bill and an invitation to a lecture on Egyptian antiquities that he had no intention of attending. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, the kind used by people who wish to appear more composed than they are. His name was written on the front in a hand that was controlled, deliberately, effortfully controlled, the way handwriting looks when someone is concentrating very hard on not revealing themselves. Inside, there was no address, no date, no signature. There were only 3 words, written in the same careful, contained hand. "Stop me, Poirot." He read it twice. Then he set it on his desk, smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, and sat very still for a long time. In his long career, he had received threats, he had received pleas, he had received confessions, accusations, lies dressed as truths, and truths dressed so elaborately as lies that they had taken months to unwrap. But he had never received this, a request to be stopped from someone who had not yet begun. Or perhaps they had. Perhaps they had already begun, and the letter was not a warning but a last desperate cry before the silence closed over them entirely. The invitation from Lady Eugenia Forbes Crail arrived 4 days later. It was, on the surface, perfectly ordinary. A weekend gathering at Ashworth Manor on the Dorset coast. A small party of interesting people, the kind of event that a man of Poirot's particular celebrity was occasionally drawn into. Lady Forbes Crail was known to him by reputation, a widow of considerable means and considerable mystery, whose late husband, Sir Edmund Forbes Crail, had died of fever in India some 8 years prior, leaving behind a large estate, a larger collection of debts, and a wife who had managed both with a composure that struck those who knew her as either admirable or deeply suspicious. Poirot had not been acquainted with Lady Forbes Crail previously. He accepted the invitation within the hour. He did not tell Captain Hastings where he was going, not immediately. Hastings had a tendency to bring warmth and confusion to situations that required cold clarity, and Poirot, for reasons he could not yet fully articulate, felt that this particular situation would require all the clarity he possessed. He packed his small case. He polished his shoes. He stood at the window of his Whitehaven Mansions flat and looked out at the London street below, grey and damp and full of ordinary people living ordinary lives. And he thought about those 3 words. "Stop me, Poirot." Someone, somewhere, was preparing to do something they themselves recognized as wrong. And they had reached out, not to the police, not to a priest, not to a friend, but to him. To the little Belgian with the egg-shaped head and the absurd mustaches, who had made it his life's work to understand what drove human beings to the absolute extremity of themselves. They had reached out to him because they believed, perhaps, that he was the only one capable of understanding. He picked up his hat from the rack by the door. He checked his reflection in the glass. Hair immaculate, mustaches perfectly symmetrical, the small dark eyes bright with something that was not quite excitement and not quite dread. "Eh bien," he said softly to himself. Let us go and see who needs to be saved." He was not certain, as he said it, whether he meant saved from committing a crime or saved from themselves. In his experience, these were frequently the same thing. The car arrived at 9:30. By 11 o'clock, he was on the road south toward the coast, toward Ashworth Manor, toward 6 people who each carried a secret they had not yet chosen to put down. And somewhere among them, one person who had written 3 words and was now, almost certainly, regretting having written them, or perhaps not regretting at all, perhaps simply waiting. The house that held its breath. Ashworth Manor appeared first as a silhouette. Poirot saw it from the car window as they crested the final hill above the Dorset coast. A dark mass against a sky the color of old pewter, sitting at the edge of the land as though it had been placed there deliberately, as close to the cliff's edge as architectural confidence would permit. Below it, invisible but audible even from this distance, the sea moved against the rocks with the slow, indifferent rhythm of something that had been doing this long before any of the present troubles and would continue long after. It was, Poirot thought, precisely the kind of house in which things happened. Not pleasant things. The drive curved through an avenue of elms that had been old when the house was built, their branches now bare enough that the sky showed through them in fragments. Grey pieces of light between black branches, like a puzzle that had been dropped and not yet reassembled. Dead leaves gathered in drifts along the verge. A crow sat on the gatepost and watched the motor car pass with an expression of profound disinterest. The house itself, seen close, was large and slightly wounded-looking. Not neglected, Lady Forbes Crail was clearly a woman who maintained appearances, but worn. The kind of worn that comes not from poverty, but from time and from the particular weight of a house that has witnessed too much to remain entirely cheerful. The stonework was Jacobean, solid and grey, the windows tall and many-paned. A wisteria that had been magnificent in its season now clung to the east wing as bare as wire. The front door opened before Poirot had finished climbing the steps. The woman who stood in the doorway was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. Lady Eugenia Forbes Crail was perhaps 60, perhaps less. Age had treated her as it sometimes treats those who have survived a great deal. It had made her more concentrated, somehow more distilled. She was not tall, but she held herself as though she were. Her hair was white and arranged with great precision. Her eyes were green and still, like water in a deep well, and when they settled on Poirot, they did not flutter or brighten with the usual social performance of welcome. They simply looked. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was even. "I'm very glad you came. I wasn't certain you would." "When a person of good taste extends an invitation," Poirot replied, removing his hat and inclining his head with the small formal courtesy that was as natural to him as breathing. "One does not refuse without excellent reason, and I had no such reason." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile and not quite its opposite. "Come in," she said. "The others have already arrived." The entrance hall was large and cold and smelled of wood smoke and old stone and something else, something faint and sweet that Poirot filed away without yet naming. The floors were flagged. The walls held portraits of the Forbes Crail family stretching back several generations. Men and women with strong chins and careful eyes. Most of them looking directly outward as though daring the observer to find them wanting. Poirot found them, on the whole, rather grim. A fire burned in the drawing-room, and around it, arranged with the self-consciousness of strangers who have been thrown together and are not yet sure of the social geometry, sat the 5 other guests. He catalogued them in the order in which they registered on his attention, which was not, he knew, the order in which they sat. The first to register was the man who did not look up when Poirot entered. He was perhaps 45, compactly built, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since become merely watchful. He sat with his legs crossed and a glass of sherry balanced on his knee, and he was examining the middle distance with an intensity that suggested he was not, in fact, looking at anything in the room. A locked briefcase sat beside his chair, leather and brass-cornered, its handle showing the slight wear of frequent handling. This, Poirot deduced, was the solicitor, Felix Crane. Beside the window stood a woman who was quite deliberately decorative. She was perhaps 35 and had the polished, constructed quality of someone who had spent a great many years being looked at and had made her peace with it by turning it into a kind of armor. Her hair was dark, her mouth wide and carefully painted, her dress the exact right shade of burgundy for the season. She held her sherry glass in her left hand, and her right arm hung at her side, the gloved fingers occasionally, almost imperceptibly, brushing against her left wrist. Vivienne Cross, the stage actress. Poirot noted the gesture. He noted also that her eyes, when they finally moved to him, were not the eyes of a woman who was used to receiving admiration. They were the eyes of a woman who was used to calculating risk. On the sofa, ramrod straight even in repose, sat Colonel Ashby Pendleton. He was 60 or thereabouts, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man for whom the army had been not a career but a skeletal structure, the thing that had held him upright when everything else failed. His decorations were not visible, but you felt their absence, the way you feel the shape of furniture beneath a dust sheet. He nodded at Poirot with the careful correctness of a man who was watching everything and commenting on nothing. A small muscle at the corner of his jaw was doing something it probably wasn't supposed to do. Dorothea Plum occupied an armchair near the fire, with the comfortable authority of a woman who has never in her life sat anywhere without first establishing that she belonged there. She was stout and pleasant-faced, somewhere in her mid-50s, wearing a dress of cheerful floral print that was perhaps slightly too cheerful for the room. She smiled at Poirot with the wide, open smile of someone who appears to have nothing to hide and has, in Poirot's experience, almost certainly something to hide. Her eyes were brown and sharp and moved with a quickness that her general air of comfortable domesticity seemed designed to disguise, and in the corner, nearly in the corner, as though she had stepped back toward it without noticing, stood Sister Marguerite. She was young, younger than the others, perhaps 28 or 30, wearing the plain dark habit of a religious order, her face framed by a white coif that should have given her an expression of tranquility. It did not. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she held them with the tight, controlled stillness of someone who is not feeling tranquil at all and knows better than to show it. She had not taken sherry. She had not, as far as Poirot could determine, moved from her corner since entering the room. Her eyes, when they met his, contained something he recognized. She was afraid. Not of him, or not only of him, of something that was already in this room. Lady Forbes Crail made the introductions with an efficiency that suggested she had been dreading this moment and wished to get through it quickly. Everyone smiled in the appropriate places. Everyone said the appropriate things. Poirot accepted a glass of the rather good sherry. He noticed with professional approval that Lady Forbes Crail served excellent sherry, and settled himself in a chair slightly apart from the group, where he could see all of them at once. And then he did what he did best. He watched. He watched Felix Crane's hand rest on the briefcase handle with a possessiveness that was almost tender. He watched Vivienne Cross position herself so that the window light fell on her left side and not her right. He watched Colonel Pendleton count the other people in the room, once, twice, a third time, with the eyes of a man who had once been responsible for the lives of soldiers and had never quite stopped being responsible for them. He watched Mrs. Plum listen, with her cheerful face arranged into an expression of pleasant interest, while her ears did something far more intelligent than her expression suggested. He watched Sister Marguerite not pray, which, for a woman of God, was the most eloquent thing she had done since Poirot entered the room. And he watched Lady Eugenia Forbes Crail stand at the edge of her own gathering with the careful, performative ease of a hostess, while somewhere behind those deep-water green eyes, something that might have been desperation moved in slow circles. "Stop me, Poirot." One of the 6 people in this room had written those words. One of them had sealed them in a cream envelope and addressed them to him with a hand they had fought to keep steady. He did not know yet which one. But the little grey cells, those tireless, elegant, infuriating little grey cells, were already, quietly, beginning to form a view. Dinner was announced at 7. Poirot set down his sherry glass, smoothed his moustaches with one precise finger, and rose from his chair. "Eh bien," he thought, not for the first time that day. "Let us begin." The note beneath the plate. The dining room at Ashworth Manor had been designed, Poirot suspected, by someone who believed that grandeur and comfort were mutually exclusive and had chosen grandeur without apparent regret. The table was long, far too long for 7 people, and had been set at one end with the kind of careful, slightly desperate elegance that speaks of a household doing its utmost with diminishing resources. The silverware was genuinely old and genuinely fine. The candelabra cast a warm light that was flattering to the room and to the faces around it. The chairs were high-backed and carved and made sitting comfortably a matter of personal determination rather than design. Poirot sat to Lady Forbes Crail's left. He had maneuvered himself there with such practiced subtlety that no one had noticed it was a maneuver at all. From this position, he could see every face. This was not an accident. The first course arrived, a clear consommé, competently made. And conversation arranged itself around the table in the way that conversation does when strangers are thrown together and are all, to varying degrees, performing. Colonel Pendleton spoke about the changing face of the countryside. Mrs. Plum spoke about a recipe for game pie that she had modified to considerable success. Felix Crane said very little and ate with the focused attention of a man who has decided that food, at least, will not betray him. Vivienne Cross performed the role of charming dinner guest with the technical precision of a woman who had spent 20 years on stage. Every laugh correctly timed, every glance deployed with purpose. Sister Marguerite ate her soup and said nothing at all. Poirot contributed pleasantly to the conversation when directly addressed and otherwise occupied himself with watching. It was a skill he had developed over decades, the ability to appear socially present while being, in truth, entirely elsewhere. He was watching the silences between words. He was watching the way eyes moved, toward each other, away from each other, toward the door, toward the briefcase that Felix Crane had placed beneath his chair, as though afraid it might wander off independently. He was watching Lady Forbes Crail. She ate very little. She spoke with the measured, hostess-trained warmth of a woman fulfilling an obligation. Twice, Poirot noticed her eyes move, briefly, involuntarily, to the far end of the table, where nothing sat but a candlestick and empty space. Both times she caught herself. Both times, the return journey of her gaze was slightly too controlled to be natural. She was thinking about someone who was not in the room, or, and the little grey cells murmured at this, someone who was in the room and had no business being there. The main course was pheasant, roasted adequately, accompanied by a burgundy that was rather better than adequate. Conversation had relaxed slightly, the wine assisting, the candlelight assisting, the shared human instinct to lower one's guard when warmth and food are present. Even Colonel Pendleton's jaw had unclenched by a measurable degree. Even Vivienne Cross had stopped calculating quite so visibly. It was, Poirot reflected, precisely the wrong moment to stop being careful. The dessert was a syllabub, accompanied by small almond biscuits arranged in a fan on each plate. Poirot looked at his portion, found it acceptable, and was lifting his spoon when he heard the sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of a chair moving, the small, abrupt scrape of wood on stone that happens when someone grips the edge of a table suddenly, not to rise but to hold on. He looked up. Lady Forbes Crail was very still, not the stillness of composure, the stillness of someone who is concentrating enormously on remaining upright. Her face had gone the color of old candle wax. Her hands were flat on the tablecloth. She was breathing, he could see that. But the breathing had a shallow, deliberate quality that he recognized from medical contexts he wished he had encountered less frequently. "Lady Forbes Crail," he said. His voice was perfectly level. He had found, over the years, that panic in a voice caused panic in a room, and panic in a room destroyed evidence. "Are you unwell?" She looked at him. Her green eyes were still and very deep. "I find," she said with extraordinary composure, "that I am not feeling entirely myself." Then she closed her eyes and slipped sideways in her chair. What followed was the controlled chaos of a household confronting crisis. Mrs. Plum making efficient noises, Colonel Pendleton pushing back his chair with military promptness, Vivienne Cross pressing herself back against the wall with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite something else. Sister Marguerite moved forward, quickly, with a purposefulness that the rest of her evening had not suggested, and was already at Lady Forbes Crail's side before anyone else had fully registered what was happening. And Dr. Raymond Holt, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table with his wine-glass and his watchful silence, stood up and said, "Let me through, please," in the calm voice of a physician who has seen emergencies before and has long since made his peace with them. He took Lady Forbes Crail's pulse. He examined her lips. Noting, Poirot observed, a particular discoloration at the corners of her mouth, a very faint bluish tinge that lasted only a moment before fading. He asked Mrs. Plum to bring cold water and asked Colonel Pendleton to open the window. He did all of this efficiently and without apparent agitation, but he did not ask what she had eaten. A person of ordinary medical instincts, confronted with sudden collapse at a dinner table, asks first about what has been consumed. It is the obvious question. It is the first question. Dr. Holt did not ask it. He already knew, Poirot thought, that food was not the issue. Lady Forbes Crail was carried to her room by Colonel Pendleton and one of the male servants. Dr. Holt accompanied them. The remaining guests stood in the dining room with the particular awkwardness of people who do not know whether to be frightened or merely inconvenienced. Poirot stood at the table. He looked at Lady Forbes Crail's place-setting. The half-finished syllabub, the wine-glass bearing her lipstick, the small fan of almond biscuits which she had not touched. Something was wrong. He looked more carefully. The plate, the syllabub glass, the arrangement of the biscuits. The biscuits had been moved, not dramatically, not thrown aside or knocked over, but the careful fan arrangement that matched every other guest's plate had been disturbed. 2 biscuits had been shifted slightly, as though something had been placed beneath them and then removed, or as though something was still there, hidden beneath the small overlap of biscuit edges. Poirot reached forward with 2 careful fingers and lifted the edge of the outermost biscuit. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper, small, neat, cream-colored. He opened it. 4 words, written in a hand he had seen before. Controlled, effortful. The handwriting of someone concentrating very hard on not revealing themselves. Day 1. I warned you. He folded the note and placed it in his breast pocket. He stood very still for a moment, aware of the room around him, the candles burning lower now, the wine in the abandoned glasses going still, the 5 remaining guests watching him with varying degrees of concealment. Warned whom? Lady Forbes Crail, or Poirot himself? And warned of what? The poisoning, or what came after it? He turned to face the room. 5 faces. 5 sets of eyes. Felix Crane, still standing beside his chair, one hand resting on the back of it with a grip slightly too tight for someone merely waiting to see what happened next. Vivian Cross, who had moved, while everyone else's attention was on Lady Forbes' Crail, approximately 3 feet closer to the door. Poirot had noticed this. He suspected she did not know that he had. Colonel Pendleton was upstairs. Sister Marguerite had gone with him, which was interesting in itself. Mrs. Dorothea Plum stood near the fireplace, her hands folded, her pleasant face wearing an expression of appropriate concern, with underneath it something that Poirot would have described, if pressed, as the expression of a woman doing arithmetic in her head. "Well," said Felix Crane into the silence. His voice was steady, too steady. "What happens now?" Poirot looked at him for a long moment. "Now," he said pleasantly, "I think we have some coffee, and we talk, and we see what the evening chooses to tell us." He moved toward the drawing room. After a moment's hesitation, the hesitation of people who do not wish to be alone and do not entirely wish to be together, the others followed. Upstairs, Lady Forbes' Crail was already breathing easier. Dr. Holt had administered something from his bag, a bag that, Poirot noted, he had brought to the dinner table, which was not standard practice for a physician attending a private social engagement. The poison, and it was a poison, Poirot was in no doubt, had been mild, calibrated, not enough to kill, just enough to render its target temporarily helpless. A demonstration, then, not an attack, or, most unsettling of all possibilities, a rehearsal. He sat in the drawing room with his coffee and his thoughts and his 5 increasingly uncomfortable companions, and he listened to the sea beyond the windows, doing what it had always done, rolling in, rolling out, indifferent to the small human dramas conducted at its edge. The note in his pocket said, "Day 1," which meant, with the particular cold clarity of arithmetic, that there were 2 days remaining, 2 days in which to understand what was happening in this house, 2 days in which to find the writer of 3 words and discover what it was they needed to be stopped from doing. Poirot sipped his coffee. It was very good coffee. Lady Forbes' Crail, whatever else she was, had excellent domestic standards. He thought about the note. He thought about Dr. Holt's missing question. He thought about the briefcase beneath Felix Crane's chair, and the scar beneath Vivian Cross's glove, and the way Sister Marguerite had moved, too quickly, too purposefully, toward a woman she was supposed barely to know. He thought about the face cut from the photograph. He had not yet found the photograph, but he knew, with the quiet certainty of long experience, that it existed. He knew it the way he sometimes knew things before the evidence arrived to confirm them, not by supernatural intuition, as people occasionally and irritatingly supposed, but by the accumulated logic of decades. When you have seen enough, patterns precede proof. Something in this house was old. Something in this house had been waiting for a very long time. And now, at last, for reasons Poirot did not yet fully understand, it had decided it was tired of waiting. Day 1, the note had said. He smoothed his mustache with one precise finger and looked at the 5 faces around him, each one carefully arranged, each one concealing its interior weather behind the social barometer of the moment. Bon, he thought. Then let us see what Day 2 brings. The Colonel's confession. Poirot did not sleep well at Ashworth Manor. This was not unusual. He rarely slept well in houses that were thinking too loudly, and Ashworth Manor was thinking very loudly indeed. He lay in the large, cold bedroom they had given him, a room on the first floor facing the sea, with windows that admitted both the moonlight and the sound of the tide with equal indifference to his preferences, and he listened to the house settle around him. Old houses make noise. This is well understood. They creak and shift as the temperature drops, as the wood contracts, as the stone releases the residual warmth of the day. These sounds are perfectly explicable and entirely innocent. But there are other sounds. The sound of a door, opened with deliberate slowness. The sound of footsteps on a corridor floor, placed with the careful lightness of someone who does not wish to be heard. The sound, once, of a drawer being opened and closed in a room 2 doors down, which was, if Poirot's mental map of the house was accurate, the room occupied by Felix Crane. He did not get up to investigate. Not yet. There was a method to these things, and the method required patience. The method required allowing the situation to develop at its own pace. Like a photograph emerging in a dark room, pressing too early, moving too soon, destroyed the image. You had to wait. You had to let the shapes clarify themselves. He lay still and listened and thought, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, the house finally stopped its particular variety of thinking, and he slept. He was up at 7. The morning had arrived grey and cold, the sky the flat, non-committal grey of English autumn at the coast. Not threatening rain, not promising sun, simply occupying the space above the sea with the impassivity of something that had decided not to take sides. The garden below his window was wet with overnight dew. The cliff's edge was visible from where he stood, a clean, straight line where the land simply stopped, and beyond it, nothing but the movement of water far below. He dressed with his usual care. He was not a man who permitted external circumstances to alter his standards of personal presentation. The symmetry of his mustaches was checked twice. His shoes were polished to a degree that the corridor flagstones did not deserve, but received nonetheless. He descended to breakfast. The breakfast room was empty when he arrived, which suited him. He ate his eggs with methodical appreciation and drank 2 cups of excellent coffee and read nothing, which was, for Poirot, a form of intense activity. Reading nothing, he found, was the best possible conditions for the little grey cells to organize themselves. They did not require stimulation. They required space. By the time the other guests began to filter in, Mrs. Plum first, brisk and warm-smiled, then Vivian Cross, who had applied her face with great precision and wore it like a shield, then Felix Crane, who acknowledged Poirot with a nod that managed to convey absolutely nothing. He had already assembled several things into a provisional order. Dr. Holt appeared at 8:30 and reported, in response to the general inquiry, that Lady Forbes Crail had passed a comfortable night and was improving. She would remain in her room for the morning, he advised, and the household should proceed as normal. Proceed as normal. In a house where the hostess had been poisoned at her own dinner table and a note had been left, theatrically, deliberately, beneath a biscuit on her plate. Colonel Pendleton did not come to breakfast. Poirot noted this without expression. He was still noting it quietly at the back of his mind when the knock came at his bedroom door at 9:20. He had returned to his room after breakfast, ostensibly to write letters, genuinely to think, and he opened the door to find Colonel Ashby Pendleton standing in the corridor with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something all night and has not yet decided whether the rehearsal was adequate. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "may I come in?" "But of course, mon colonel, please." Poirot stepped back. "Sit down. I will ring for coffee." "No." The colonel entered and remained standing, which was, Poirot recognized, a military habit in moments of difficulty, the body defaulting to the posture of accountability. "No, thank you. I won't be long. There is something I need to tell you." Poirot sat in the armchair by the window and folded his hands in his lap. "Then please tell it." The colonel looked out the window at the sea. The muscle in his jaw was moving again. 17 years ago, he said, "I was stationed in Cairo, 1917. The war was still running, and Cairo was a particular kind of madness in those years. You understand? The heat, the dislocation, the sense that the normal rules were temporarily suspended." He paused. Poirot said nothing. He had learned over many years that silence was the best possible encouragement for a man who had decided to speak. "There was a girl," the colonel continued. His voice was the voice of a man reading from a document he finds very painful, flat and careful and effortful. "A servant girl. She worked in the household where several of us were, billeted in a loose sense. She was perhaps 16, perhaps a little older. Her name was Fatima." He said the name differently from the rest of the sentence, with a weight that the other words did not carry. She had found something out. Something about one of my fellow officers. Something that would have caused considerable difficulty for a man of significant rank." He stopped again. "She was silenced," Poirot said quietly. "Not a question." The colonel's jaw tightened. "She died. The official record described it as an accident, a fall. The stairs of the house were steep and the lighting was poor." He turned from the window and looked directly at Poirot. His eyes were a pale, clear blue, and at this moment they were entirely without evasion. "I did not push her. I want to be precise about that. I was present. I was in the corridor. I could have intervened. I chose not to. I told myself at the time that I didn't fully understand what was happening. I've spent 17 years knowing that this was a lie I told myself." Silence. Outside, a gull cried. Once, briefly, and then the sound was absorbed by the vast indifference of the sea. "The officer," Poirot said. "He is alive?" "He was alive the last I knew." Something shifted in the colonel's expression. "I have not maintained contact. It was not possible to maintain contact and also to function as a human being." Poirot studied him for a long moment. Then he said, "Mon colonel, I'm going to ask you something, and I ask that you answer with the same honesty that has brought you to this room this morning. Did you write to me recently, before this gathering, an unsigned letter?" The colonel frowned. Genuine confusion. Poirot was quite certain of it. "No. I had no knowledge that you would be here until Lady Forbes Crail mentioned your name in her invitation letter. I confess the mention of your name was somewhat alarming. And yet you came." "I came because—" He stopped. Started again. "I came because I have been carrying this for 17 years, and it has become very heavy, Monsieur Poirot. And when I saw your name, I thought, perhaps this is the moment that has finally decided to arrive." Poirot nodded slowly. "You did not write the letter," he said, half to himself. "But you were meant to come here. You were perhaps expected." He looked up. "Tell me, mon colonel, who else knew about Cairo? About what happened to the girl called Fatima?" The colonel sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The military posture had relaxed, not into comfort, but into something more honest than posture, into the actual shape of a man who was very tired. "The officer," he said, myself, and one other person, a woman who was present in that household, a woman who saw everything." He rubbed his face with both hands. A gesture of exhaustion so genuine it was almost painful to witness. "I don't know what became of her afterward. I tried not to know." Poirot thought about this. He thought about Lady Forbes Crail's green eyes, still as deep water. He thought about a photograph from 20 years ago and a face that had been removed from it with surgical precision. He thought about a gathering of 6 people, each of whom, by Lady Forbes Crail's own peculiar claim, owed her a secret. "Mon colonel," he said, "I'm grateful for your courage this morning. It is not a small thing what you have done. But I must tell you something, and I ask that you receive it carefully." He leaned forward slightly. "You did not write that letter to me. And yet the letter was written, which means that someone in this house, someone who arranged this gathering, or someone who came to it, Already knew what you have just told me. Already knew about Cairo. Already knew about Fatima. He paused. You came here believing you had arrived at your own reckoning. I think, rather, that someone arranged for you to be here, someone who needed you present. Needed me. The colonel looked at him with the expression of a man who has just understood something he wishes he hadn't. As a witness, or as something else? That, Poirot said, is precisely what I intend to discover. He rose from his chair and was smoothing his mustache. That small, habitual gesture of transition between one mode of thought and another, when the sound came from below. Not a crash, not a shout. Something worse. The particular hollow thud of a weight falling against a hard surface, followed by a silence with texture to it. The silence of something having just happened. Poirot was out the door before the colonel had risen from the bed. He went quickly down the corridor and down the stairs to the ground floor where the door to the cellar stairs stood open. It should not have been open. He had noted this morning that it was closed. And at the bottom of those stairs, in the cold, stone-floored space below, lay Colonel Ashby Pendleton. No, he corrected himself, turning. The colonel was behind him, having followed from the bedroom. The figure at the bottom of the cellar stairs was not the colonel. It was the colonel's coffee cup from breakfast, rolling in a small circle on the stone floor. And it was a man, breathing, alive, but unconscious, one arm bent beneath him, a bruise already forming at the temple where he had met the corner of the stone step. Dr. Holt. Poirot descended carefully. One hand on the railing. He crouched beside the doctor and confirmed what the breathing had already told him. Alive, pulse steady, the unconsciousness, the kind that comes from impact rather than from chemical interference. He had been hit or pushed. The angle of the fall suggested pushed, from behind, from the top of the stairs, by someone who had since closed no doors and made no sounds and left, as far as Poirot could determine, no trace whatsoever. He looked up the stairs at Colonel Pendleton, who stood at the top looking down with the pale, alarmed face of a man to whom violence has not yet become merely an abstraction. "He is alive," Poirot said. "Please fetch Mrs. Plum. Do not fetch anyone else." He remained crouched beside the unconscious doctor and looked at the man's hands, his pockets, the floor around him. He was looking for something specific. He did not find it, which meant that whoever had pushed Dr. Holt down the cellar stairs had done so not to rob him, but to silence him, to prevent him from saying something, or from doing something, or from showing something to someone he should not have shown it to. Poirot stood. He thought about the locked briefcase. He thought about the note that said Day 1. He thought about a nun who had moved too quickly toward a woman she barely knew, and a solicitor who guarded a briefcase as though it contained something that could end a life, and a physician who had known the name of a poison before it was named. And he thought, with the particular unease of a man who prides himself on orderly thinking, finding himself confronted with something genuinely disordered, that this house was not containing one secret. It was containing several, and they were beginning now, with the inevitability of a tide coming in, to collide. Day 2, the first note had implied, was coming. It had, apparently, arrived early. The empty room, Dr. Holt regained consciousness at 11:30. Poirot was there when he did, sitting in the chair beside the spare room bed into which they had carried the doctor, patient as only a man entirely certain of his own purpose can be patient. Mrs. Plum had done the practical work with impressive competence. Cold cloth, blanket, the particular brisk tenderness of a woman who has managed other people's crises before and has developed a system. Colonel Pendleton had stood uselessly in the doorway until Poirot had suggested, with great courtesy, that he might perhaps be more comfortable elsewhere. The others had been told that Dr. Holt had slipped on the cellar stairs. Poirot had not contradicted this. Not yet. When the doctor's eyes opened, the slow, uncertain opening of someone returning from somewhere they had not chosen to go, Poirot leaned forward very slightly and said, in a tone of perfect pleasantness, "Good morning, mon ami. Or perhaps good afternoon. It is approaching noon. How is the head?" Holt blinked, focused. His eyes, Poirot noticed, went through several rapid calculations before they settled into the expression he chose to present, which was confusion, mild and cooperative. It was a reasonable choice. It was also, Poirot suspected, not entirely authentic. "I don't remember," Holt began. "Non," Poirot said pleasantly. "I imagine you do not. These things are often, how shall I say, selectively unclear." He smiled. The smile was warm and gave nothing away. "You were found at the bottom of the cellar stairs. You had apparently fallen." A pause. "Apparently," Holt repeated. "It is the word I chose. Yes." Another pause, longer, during which the two men regarded each other with the particular quality of attention that exists between people who are both, in their different ways, very good at understanding what is not being said. "I need to ask you something, Docteur," Poirot said, "and I ask it not as an investigator making an accusation, but as a man attempting to understand a situation of some complexity before it becomes a situation of greater complexity. You understand the distinction?" "I understand it." "Bon. Last evening at dinner, when Lady Forbes Crail was taken ill, you examined her. You were very capable, very calm. You administered something from your bag, which you had brought to the dinner table, which is not, shall we say, the standard preparation of a physician attending a social gathering." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "What was it that you administered?" Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A mild restorative. Smelling salts, essentially. Nothing more complicated." "And the diagnosis? The nature of her collapse?" "Vasovagal syncope. Fainting. Not uncommon in women of her age, and constitution." Poirot nodded agreeably. "And the bluish discoloration at the corners of her mouth, the particular quality of her breathing, these are also consistent with fainting." Silence. The silence of a man who had hoped, not very seriously, that he had not been observed. "You knew what it was," Poirot said. "Not an accusation, simply a statement delivered with the quiet certainty of something already decided. You identified the substance before you examined her. The question, and it is the question I would very much like answered, Doctor, for reasons which I think you can appreciate, is how you knew." Holt looked at the ceiling. His jaw moved slightly, the way jaws move when someone is selecting very carefully from among the things they might say. "I've seen it before," he said finally. "The compound, the presentation?" "Where?" A long pause. "In a case, years ago. A patient. A patient who had been poisoned. A patient who had administered something to herself." "Yes." Poirot sat back. "Herself," he said. He let the words sit between them for a moment. "You are telling me, then, that last evening's episode was self-administered?" Holt said nothing, which was, Poirot reflected, the clearest possible confirmation. He rose from his chair, smoothed his jacket, and looked at the doctor with an expression that contained, in approximately equal measure, understanding and warning. "Rest," he said. "We will speak again this evening. And Doctor," he paused at the door, "I would advise you in the interim to consider very carefully what else you know about the events in this house. Not because I will compel you to tell me, but because I think you came here, like the Colonel, like perhaps several others in this gathering, because you were, in some sense, invited to come to a reckoning, and reckonings, in my experience, are considerably less painful when one chooses them rather than waiting to have them chosen for one." He left the doctor to his thinking. The corridor outside was empty and quiet. Poirot stood in it for a moment, listening to the house. It was the particular mid-morning quiet of a place in which everyone was separately occupied with their own version of anxiety, and the walls between the rooms were doing their usual inadequate job of containing it. He wanted to speak with Sister Marguerite. He had wanted to speak with her since the previous evening. When she had moved toward Lady Forbes' cradle with that purposeful, proprietary swiftness that had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. Small, difficult to ignore. Her room was on the second floor at the end of the East Wing corridor, the oldest part of the house, where the floorboards were most vocal and the wallpaper had given up its original color to time and damp. Poirot climbed the stairs and walked the corridor, noting the doors as he passed. Sister Marguerite's door was the last one on the left. It was open, not ajar, open, wide, as though someone had left in a hurry, or as though someone had left with sufficient deliberateness to make a point. He stood in the doorway. The room was empty. Not merely unoccupied, empty. The wardrobe door hung open and contained nothing. The small case that had presumably held Sister Marguerite's belongings was gone. The bed had been slept in, and the sheets were still turned back, but the pillow held the dented impression of a head that would not be returning to make use of it. Everything personal had been removed with the efficiency of someone who had known, perhaps for some time, that this moment would come, and had prepared for it accordingly. Except for two things. On the bedside table, a rosary. Plain wooden beads on a simple cord, the crucifix at the end, small and unadorned. It had been placed there with care. Not dropped, not abandoned, but placed. Deliberately left. And beneath it, slipped just under the edge of the rosary, so that the beads lay across its corner like a frame. A photograph. Poirot crossed to the table and picked up the photograph carefully. By its edge. It was old. 20 years, perhaps more. The image had the slightly softened quality of photographs from that period, the tones warm and faded at the margins. It showed a woman standing in a garden. Some formal garden, roses visible behind her, a stone balustrade to one side. She was perhaps 40 in this image, dressed in the fashion of the early part of the century, and she was looking at the camera with the particular expression of someone who has been asked to look pleasant and has complied while being privately elsewhere. It was Lady Forbes' Crail, younger but unmistakable. The green eyes, the composed posture, the quality of deliberate containment. She was not alone. Beside her stood a man. He was tall, broader than she was, his hand resting at the small of her back in the gesture of a husband or a lover, or someone who has the habit of possession. He wore a light summer suit. He was looking not at the camera, but at the woman beside him. And the expression on the portion of his face that remained visible was one of a man who is entirely certain of his claim. The portion of his face that remained visible. Because the photograph had been altered. Not clumsily, not torn or scratched, but cut. With something precise. A small blade, perhaps a penknife. The man's face had been removed from the image with surgical neatness, leaving a clean oval absence where his features should have been. The cut was confident. The hand that had made it had not hesitated. Poirot stood for a long time looking at the space where a face should have been. Then he turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting he did not recognize. A younger hand, less controlled than the letter, the handwriting of someone who had not yet learned to disguise themselves, were 4 words. He is still alive. Poirot set the photograph down on the table beside the rosary. He walked to the window and looked out at the east garden below, a walled garden, formal, the box hedges clipped with the care of old habit. It was empty, or almost empty. At the far gate, which led from the garden to the path along the cliff top, he saw, for just a moment before it was gone, the hem of a dark habit disappearing around the corner of the wall. Sister Marguerite. Not gone from the house entirely, then. Gone from her room. Gone from the safety of walls and witnessed spaces. Gone to the cliff path. Poirot did not run. He was not a man built for running, and he was not, in any case, convinced that running was the correct response to this information. He descended the stairs with brisk purpose, retrieved his overcoat from the stand near the front door. A man of his sensibilities did not venture onto a Dorset cliff top in October without adequate preparation, and went out through the side door into the walled garden. The air outside hit him with the cold, salt-edged clarity of a coast in autumn. The box hedges were damp. His shoes, excellent as they were, registered the wet grass with the mild protest of good leather encountering conditions it considers beneath it. He went through the gate and onto the cliff path. It was narrow, a chalk-cut path along the cliff's edge, the land falling away sharply to the left toward the water far below. The sea was grey and restless this morning, the kind of sea that is not dangerous but wants you to know that it could be. Gulls rode the updrafts with their characteristic air of contemptuous ease. Sister Marguerite was perhaps 30 yards ahead of him, standing at a point where the path widened slightly, and a wooden bench, old, weathered, the kind of bench placed by someone long ago who believed people might want to sit and look at this view, offered a place to be still. She was not sitting. She was standing at the bench, her hands on its back rail, looking out at the water, and she did not turn when Poirot's footsteps on the chalk path announced him. She had heard him. He was quite sure of that. She had simply decided not to perform the ritual of surprise. He came to stand beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the sea offered its voice to fill the space between them. Then Poirot said quietly, "The rosary was a message." "Yes," she said. Her voice was low and even. Up close, without the dim candlelight of the dining room, she was younger than he had assessed, mid-20s perhaps. The habit sat on her with the slight wrongness of a costume rather than a vocation. "I left it for you specifically. I thought if I left it for anyone else, it would be lost or suppressed." "And the photograph?" A pause. "Yes. You know who the man in the photograph is." Not a question. She heard this, and something in her shoulders, held very tightly since Poirot had come within range, shifted fractionally. "I know who he is," she said. "I have known for 3 years. Finding him, finding out that he was alive, was not." She stopped. It was not a simple thing to discover. Poirot looked out at the sea. A fishing boat moved across the grey water in the middle distance, small and purposeful. "You are not a nun," he said. The silence that followed was the silence of relief, the relief of not having to carry a pretense a single step further. "No," she said. "I am not." "Then who are you, mademoiselle?" She turned to look at him for the first time. Her eyes, and this, Poirot thought, was something he should have attended to more carefully at the dinner table. Her eyes were green, not the dark, fashionable green of a woman who has learned to use her appearance as a tool. The pale, still green of deep water, the precise green of Lady Eugenia Forbes Crail's eyes. "My name," she said, "is Claire. And the woman in that photograph—" Her voice did not tremble, but it did something adjacent to trembling, something controlled with great effort, "is my mother." Poirot looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and then, with the small, careful nod of a man who has just watched the first clear shape emerge from the developing photograph, he said, "I think, mademoiselle, that you had better tell me everything." The sea moved below them. The gulls turned in the cold air, and on a bench on a Dorset cliff top in the autumn of 1934, a young woman who had spent her life being someone else began, at last, to tell the truth. What Claire knew was she had been born in the spring of 1906. This was the first fact she offered, and she offered it the way people offer first facts when they are about to say something very large. Carefully, quietly, as though testing the ground before committing their full weight to it. Poirot said nothing. He had sat down on the weathered bench, his overcoat buttoned against the October wind, and he listened with a complete, unhurried attention that was, in its way, the most powerful tool he possessed. People who felt genuinely listened to said more than they intended. They always had. They always would. Claire, he had already, privately, stopped thinking of her as Sister Marguerite. Remained standing. She spoke to the sea rather than to him, which he understood. Some things are easier to say when you are not watching the face of your listener. I was told, she said, from the age of 5, that my mother had died. This was told to me by the woman who raised me, a Miss Alderton in Wiltshire, a perfectly decent woman. Brisk, not unkind, but not warm. I was told that my mother had been a widow, that she had died of fever, and that Miss Alderton was a distant relation who had agreed to take me in. A pause. The wind moved through the dark fabric of her habit. I believed this until I was 19. Children believe what they are given to believe. It is one of the more efficiently cruel facts of childhood. What happened when you were 19? Poirot asked. Miss Alderton died. Claire's voice was level. She died rather suddenly, a stroke. And in going through her things, I found letters. They were tied with string in a box at the back of her wardrobe, beneath several winter coats, which I think tells you everything you need to know about how hidden she intended them to be. A brief, humorless compression of the lips that was not quite a smile. The letters were from my mother, from Lady Eugenia Forbes Crail, though she was not yet Lady Forbes Crail when the letters began. She was Eugenia Marsh. She was 22. She was, from the content of the letters, frightened. Frightened of what? Of him. The two words carried a weight disproportionate to their size. Of the man in the photograph. His name, the name he was using at the time, was Edmund Forbes Crail. He was older than her by 20 years. They had been married for 3 years when I was born. And the letters to Miss Alderton, whom my mother had known since childhood, described a man who was... She stopped, chose her next word with visible care. Dangerous. Poirot waited. Not in the obvious ways. Not violent. Not physically. Or not primarily. The kind of dangerous that is harder to name. The kind that leaves no marks. She turned slightly, her profile sharp against the grey sky. He controlled everything. The money, the correspondence, the household, who she spoke to, and when and for how long. He told her what to think about herself, and he repeated it consistently enough that she began to believe it. And when she became pregnant, when I was coming, he told her that a child would be inconvenient, that he had made arrangements. Her voice thinned slightly on this last phrase, as though the words themselves had an edge. He had decided that the child, that I, would be placed with someone suitable and never spoken of again. He had already selected Miss Alderton. He had already paid her. My mother had no say. She was not consulted. She was informed. And yet she wrote letters, Poirot said. Claire looked at him. Yes. She wrote letters she knew Miss Alderton would keep. She wrote them carefully, never saying anything that could be used against her directly, but saying enough. Leaving a record, as though she knew even then that someday someone would need to know what had happened. A pause. She was protecting me, in the only way she was allowed to. Poirot thought about Lady Forbes Crail as he had observed her. The green eyes, still as deep water. The controlled composure that had struck him from the first moment as something maintained at considerable personal cost. 20 years of it, perhaps more. When did you find out that Sir Edmund Forbes Crail was not dead? He asked. Claire wrapped her arms around herself. Not from cold, Poirot thought, but from the instinct to contain something. 2 years ago. I had been searching. Not very effectively, I'm not a detective. A glance at him that carried something wry and brief and instantly suppressed, but I had been trying to trace what I could. He was supposed to have died in India, 18 months in the grave officially. I found an obituary. I found the death notice in 2 newspapers. She paused. And then I found him. How? By accident, which is how one finds most things that one has spent a very long time looking for. She moved from the bench railing and sat down beside Poirot. Not close, but in the position of someone who has decided that standing is no longer the right posture for what she's saying. I was in London. I was working. I had trained as a nurse, which is where the medical knowledge that presumably made the habit slightly more convincing came from, and I was walking in Kensington on a Tuesday afternoon and I saw him. You recognized him? If you had never met him, I had a photograph. One photograph from a newspaper, a society column from 1928. He was at some function. I'd been carrying it in my purse for 3 years. She looked down at her hands. I recognized him immediately. He walks, he holds himself, in a particular way, as though the space around him belongs to him and other people are merely passing through it. Something moved in her face. He was well dressed. He was laughing. He had a companion, a younger man, and they were talking the way men talk when they are comfortable and prosperous and expect to go on being so indefinitely. And you followed him? I followed him, she confirmed. I am not proud of this. It was not a rational decision, but I needed to know. I followed him to a solicitor's office in Holborn. The same offices, I later confirmed, where a Mr. Felix Crane is employed. The name landed between them on the bench with the quiet precision of a chess piece placed on a significant square. Poirot looked at the sea. So, Felix Crane, the locked briefcase, the forged death certificate that Poirot had deduced must exist, the paper mechanism by which a living man had made himself officially dead, and the solicitor who had prepared it, or witnessed it, or concealed it, and who had been sitting for 3 days in this house with that mechanism locked in a brass-cornered case at his feet, guarding it with the anxious devotion of a man who knows that what he is guarding is, in the most precise legal sense, evidence. You contacted your mother, Poirot said. I wrote to her. It took considerable courage, or perhaps recklessness. It is sometimes difficult to distinguish the two. A breath. I wrote to her at the manor. I told her who I was. I told her what I had found. I waited for her not to reply, because I had been waiting for things not to happen for most of my life, and I was reasonably practiced at the expectation. But she replied. She replied within a week. Claire's voice changed on this, very slightly. A softening so small that a less attentive listener would have missed it entirely. The letter was careful, formal. She did not use my name. She wrote as though replying to an inquiry from a stranger, but she confirmed everything. She told me that she knew he was alive. She had known for some time. She did not say how long. She told me that she had been managing the situation. Managing it, Poirot repeated. In what sense? She did not explain. She said only that she had a plan and that she was asking me to trust her and to wait. A pause. She had not asked me anything before. She had never communicated with me directly in 27 years. And now she was asking me to trust her. Did you? A long silence. Below, the sea made its slow, iterative argument against the cliffs. I waited for a year, Claire said. Then I wrote again. She replied again, still formal, still careful, but this time she included the details of this gathering. She told me I was to come. She told me to come as Sister Marguerite. Her mouth tightened. She chose the name. I found it rather pointed, actually. Marguerite. The flower. Something planted and then left. Poirot almost said something then, almost offered the small, quiet acknowledgement of that particular pain. But he stopped himself. Not from indifference, but because he understood that Claire was not telling him this in order to be comforted. She was telling him because it was the truth, and she had been carrying it at significant personal expense, and she was done. "She did not tell you," Poirot said. "Who else would be here?" "No, I recognized Dr. Holt when I arrived. I had seen him once at the Holborn offices, leaving as I was watching from across the street. I did not know his name then. I know it now." She looked at Poirot directly. "He is the man who prepared the medical documentation, the cause of death in India. He was the physician on record." Another piece, another square. Dr. Holt, who had recognized the poison before Poirot named it because Dr. Holt had almost certainly helped to source it, or had at minimum encountered it before in a context directly related to the events of this house. Dr. Holt, who had been pushed down the cellar stairs by someone who needed him silenced before he could say something, or show something, to Poirot. And Felix Crane, with his forged death certificate in a locked briefcase, sitting at the dinner table every evening with the expression of a man who has made an error of judgment so significant that he can see no possible exit from it and has therefore decided that the best available strategy is stillness. And Vivienne Cross, with her burn scar and her hollow eyes and her left wrist that she could not stop touching. And Mrs. Dorothea Plum, with her cheerful face and her sharp ears and her particular gift for being present in a room without appearing to occupy it. And Lady Forbes Crail, who had poisoned herself at her own dinner table with a substance calibrated not to kill, but to send a message. To someone in that room, to several people in that room. Day one. "I warned you." Warned whom? Warned them all, Poirot now suspected. Warned them that she had assembled them here with deliberate purpose, and that the purpose was proceeding according to plan, and that whatever they had imagined, they might do to prevent it. Whatever conversations they had been having in the corridors at 3 in the morning, whatever decisions had been made in Holborn solicitors' offices and medical consultation rooms and backstage dressing rooms, was insufficient. She had brought them all here. She had assembled them like pieces on a board, and she had placed Poirot among them, invited him specifically, not to investigate, not precisely, but to witness, to be the person in the room who would understand what he was seeing and who could be trusted in her calculation, to see it correctly. The letter. "Stop me, Poirot." He had assumed from the beginning that the letter was a cry for help. Someone on the edge of an action they regretted in advance, reaching out to be pulled back. But what if it was not that? What if stop me did not mean prevent me from doing something terrible? What if it meant stop me if I have gone too far? Stop me if the justice I am pursuing becomes something I should not pursue alone? What if the letter was not a warning but a commission? Poirot sat with this thought for a long, still moment. The sea moved. The gulls turned. Beside him, Claire, who had spent 27 years being someone planted and left and not returned for, sat with her hands in her lap and waited for him to speak. "Mademoiselle," he said at last, "I have one more question." "Yes." "The man in the photograph. The man whose face was removed." He looked at her. "He is here, in this house. You know this. Your mother knows this. I believe I know it." A pause. "Which of the 5 remaining guests is Edmund Forbes Crail?" Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him, and Poirot, who had believed himself prepared for most answers, sat very still on his weathered bench above the October sea and felt the particular sensation, rare enough in his experience to be notable, of something he had not expected. Not surprise, precisely. Something more complicated than surprise. Something that was part understanding, part sorrow, and part the specific, cold admiration of a man who has just recognized in another person a quality of patience and endurance so extraordinary that it demands acknowledgement even when, especially when, it has produced consequences that cannot yet be fully calculated. He stood. He straightened his coat. He looked out at the sea for one more moment. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, and to the sea and to the grey October sky, and to the house behind him that had been holding its breath for 20 years, "Eh bien, now we see everything." And he turned and walked back toward Ashworth Manor. The briefcase opens. Felix Crane was in the library. Poirot found him there at 1:30 in the afternoon, standing at the window with his back to the door and his hands clasped behind him in the posture of a man conducting a very serious internal argument with himself. The briefcase was on the library table. Still locked, still brass-cornered, still wearing its air of a thing that contained something the world was not yet supposed to see. The library itself was the best room in the house. Poirot had decided this on his first tour of Ashworth Manor, and nothing since had revised his opinion. It had the quality that only rooms which have been genuinely used for their intended purpose possess. The particular lived-in warmth of a space that has held human thought for a long time and has absorbed some of it into its walls. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 sides. The books were real books, red books, books with the slightly irregular spines of volumes that have been taken down and replaced many times. A library that exists only for decoration has a different look entirely. Too neat, too uniform, too self-conscious. This library had been used. This library had been, at some point in its history, loved. Poirot closed the door behind him. Crane turned at the sound. His face went through a rapid sequence of adjustments. Surprise, composure, something that might have been relief if relief had been filtered through 3 days of sustained anxiety, and settled on the expression of a man who has decided to be professionally courteous until he understands what is required of him. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I was wondering when you'd find me." "Were you?" Poirot moved to the armchair nearest the fireplace and sat down with the deliberate ease of a man with nowhere particular to be. "And were you hoping I would find you, or hoping I would not?" Crane looked at him for a moment. Then he crossed the chair on the opposite side of the fireplace and sat down. And in sitting, in choosing to sit rather than to remain standing and maintaining the psychological advantage of height, he made a decision that Poirot noted with quiet approval. A man who sits down has, in some sense, chosen to be honest. Standing is the posture of defense. Sitting is the posture of, if not confession, then at least conversation. "Both," Crane said, "simultaneously. It has been a somewhat contradictory few days." "For many people in this house," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "Tell me, Monsieur Crane, how long have you been employed by the man currently residing in Ashworth Manor under a name that is not his own?" The directness landed on Crane the way Poirot had intended it to, not as an attack, but as a relief. The relief of not having to approach the subject obliquely. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something in his face had simplified. "7 years," he said. "7 years." Poirot considered this. "And in those 7 years, what was the nature of your arrangement?" Crane leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at the fireplace. The fire had been lit earlier in the morning, and had settled now into a steady, low burn. The kind that gives heat without drama, which was, Poirot thought, precisely the kind of fire the moment required. "I was a junior solicitor," Crane said, 26 years old. "I had debt, a great deal of debt, the kind that accumulates when one is young and foolish and believes that circumstances will improve before they worsen. He came to the firm with a commission. He needed a death documented, officially, legally, irreversibly documented. A death that had not actually occurred." A pause. He was very specific about what he required. He was also very specific about what he was prepared to offer in exchange. Which was the debt cleared, a retainer that would make me comfortable for years, and Crane's jaw tightened. The assurance that my name would never be connected to the matter as long as I performed the service and maintained complete discretion afterward. And you agreed. I was 26 and frightened, Crane said. The absence of self-justification in this statement was, Poirot found, unexpectedly dignified. He was not excusing himself. He was simply describing what had happened with the flat accuracy of someone who has had a great deal of time to look at it clearly. Yes, I agreed. I prepared the documentation. I filed what needed to be filed. I provided what was needed. He looked at Poirot. Dr. Holt provided the medical certification. I provided the legal framework. Between us, we made Edmund Forbes Crail officially dead. And he became George Alderton, Crane said. Poirot was very still. Alderton, the same name as the woman in Wiltshire who had raised Claire for 27 years. Miss Alderton, brisk and not unkind, who had kept letters tied with string in a box beneath her winter coats and had died of a stroke before she could be asked the questions those letters raised. Not a coincidence. There were, in Poirot's experience, almost no coincidences. There were only patterns that had not yet been fully seen. He chose the name deliberately, Poirot said. Not a question. I believe so. Yes. Crane looked uncomfortable. A different quality of discomfort from the sustained anxiety of the past 3 days. The discomfort of a man who is now seeing something he had previously chosen not to look at directly. I didn't ask about the name. I thought it wiser not to ask questions I didn't need answered. A philosophy, Poirot said mildly, that has considerable short-term convenience and rather significant long-term cost. Crane accepted this without argument. Yes. And in 7 years, attending to this man's legal affairs under his assumed identity, you learn things. About his history. About what he had done. A long pause. I learned enough, Crane said carefully, to understand why he had needed to disappear. Why a man of his particular character might find it useful to be officially dead. He stopped. There were financial matters. There were other matters. Matters relating to his treatment of certain people over a number of years. I did not investigate, but one cannot manage a man's affairs for 7 years without accumulating a picture. And what does the picture show? Crane looked at the fire. It shows a man who has spent his entire life treating other people as instruments, as things to be used and, when they cease to be useful, to be set aside, or a slight hesitation, or worse. The girl in Cairo, Poirot said quietly. Fatima. Crane looked at him sharply. You know about that. I know what the colonel told me. I suspect you know more. A silence. Then, there was a file, among his papers. Papers he asked me to organize and store when he first retained me. Most of it was financial, but there was one folder, unmarked, that I opened. Once. I should not have opened it. I wish often that I had not. He pressed his hands together. It contained correspondence. From Cairo, from 1917, letters between him and a senior army contact, discussing the management of a situation. A girl who had seen something she should not have seen. The letters were... He stopped. They were written by men who were not troubled. That was the most disturbing thing. They discussed it the way one discusses a minor administrative inconvenience. Poirot thought of Colonel Pendleton, who had carried his portion of this story for 17 years like a stone in his chest, who had walked into Poirot's bedroom that morning and laid it down with the careful, exhausted relief of someone who can no longer bear the weight but has not known, until now, where to put it. The briefcase, Poirot said. Crane looked at it. It sat on the table with its brass corners and its locked face and its 7 years of accumulated knowledge inside it. And it seemed to Poirot, perhaps fancifully, but he had long since stopped apologizing for the occasional fancy. To be waiting. "It contains copies," Crane said, "of everything. The death certification, the legal filings, the correspondence from Cairo. I made a copy years ago when I first understood fully what I was involved in. The financial records showing the network of accounts he operates under the Alderton name. Everything." He looked at Poirot. "I made the copies because I told myself, that someday I might need them, that someday someone might need them, that they should exist somewhere in someone's hands, who was not him. And you brought them here." "Lady Forbes Crail wrote to me," Crane said. 3 months ago. The letter was formal, brief. She said she was aware that I had been in the employ of her husband. She said she was aware of the nature of that employment. She said that she was hosting a gathering at Ashworth Manor in October, and that she would consider it a great personal favor if I would attend and bring with me any documentation I had retained relating to my work for Mr. George Alderton. He met Poirot's eyes. "She knew," Poirot said. "She knew everything. She has known, I think, for considerably longer than she has let on to anyone." A pause. She also mentioned in a postscript that Hercule Poirot would be among the guests. Poirot absorbed this. Lady Forbes Crail, who had assembled this gathering with the quiet, implacable patience of a woman who has spent 20 years preparing for a single specific moment, who had written to her solicitor, her physician, her daughter, her husband's oldest witness, and to Poirot, who had poisoned herself at her own dinner table not in desperation, but as a signal. A clock being started. Day 1. I warned you, not a warning to Poirot, a warning to the man sitting somewhere in this house under a dead man's name, believing himself safe because he had built his safety so thoroughly, so legally, so completely that it seemed impenetrable. She had been telling him, "I know you are here. I know what you have done, and I have assembled every piece of evidence, every witness, every document, and the one man in England capable of putting it all together correctly." The clock has started. "You have 3 days to decide what kind of man you will be at the end of this." "The key," Poirot said. Crane reached into his breast pocket and produced a small brass key. He looked at it for a moment. The look of a man setting down something he has carried too long, and then he leaned forward and placed it on the arm of Poirot's chair. Poirot picked it up. He rose, crossed to the library table, and unlocked the briefcase. Inside, as Crane had described, documents, ordered, dated, meticulously kept, the way a man keeps things when he suspects that someday they will matter. The death certificate, official, stamped, bearing Dr. Holt's signature in the careful hand of a young physician who had not yet understood what he was signing. The legal filings, the financial records, column after column of figures under the name George Alderton, a prosperous ghost living on the infrastructure of a dead man's identity. And at the bottom, in a separate folder, unmarked, the Cairo correspondence. 7 letters, written in the efficient, unhurried hand of men conducting ordinary business. Poirot read them. He read them with the expression of a man examining something that does not surprise him, but that he wishes, nonetheless, were different. He had been in this profession long enough to have lost the capacity for shock. He had not lost, and never expected to lose, the capacity for sorrow. He closed the folder. He closed the briefcase. He straightened. "Monsieur Crane," he said, turning, "I'm going to ask you to remain in this library for the next hour. I'm going to ask you not to speak to anyone, not to the other guests, not to the servants, and most particularly not to George Alderton. Can you do this?" Crane nodded. He looked, Poirot thought, lighter. The lightness of a man from whom something very heavy has been lifted, mixed with the apprehension of a man who understands that the lifting of that weight is only the beginning of what comes next. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "what happens now?" To me, I mean. Legally. Poirot looked at him for a moment. "I'm not a judge," he said, "and I'm not a prosecutor. What you did out of fear and youth and a failure of moral imagination that you have spent 7 years regretting. This does not erase it, but it is—" A pause. "Context, and context, in my experience, matters." He picked up the briefcase. "The law will make its own determinations. I can only tell you that a man who hands over the evidence himself is viewed very differently from a man from whom evidence must be extracted." He carried the briefcase to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. "Tell me one thing more," he said without turning. "George Alderton, which guest is he? Confirm it for me." Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he said a name. Poirot nodded once, opened the door, stepped into the corridor. The name had confirmed what Claire had told him on the cliff top. The final piece had been in place for some time now, sitting in a chair at the dinner table, eating pheasant and drinking Burgundy with the comfortable ease of a man who has been safe for so long that safety has become his natural state. Not for much longer. Poirot stood in the corridor with the briefcase in his hand and thought about day 2, which was nearly over, which meant day 3 was coming. The day that Lady Forbes Crail had been building toward for 20 years. He smoothed his moustache with one careful finger. "Eh bien," he said softly. "Tomorrow, then. We finish this." The face in the room. That evening, Poirot did something he had not done since arriving at Ashworth Manor. He sat down with no particular objective. He sat in the small chair by his bedroom window, the briefcase on the floor beside him, the photograph, Claire's photograph, the one with the oval absence where a face should have been, propped against the lamp on the bedside table, and he allowed himself the particular luxury of thinking without direction, not assembling, not concluding. Simply letting the accumulated details of 3 days move through his mind the way water moves through a landscape, finding its own level, settling into the lowest and most truthful places. Outside, the sea had changed its mood. The afternoon's restless grey had darkened into something more deliberate. A night sea, black and heavy, with a wind behind it that made the windows of the manor press and creak in their frames, like things trying to communicate. The sky held no stars. The cliff's edge, invisible now in the darkness, was present only as a sound, the rhythmic concussion of waves against chalk, patient and remorseless. He thought about Lady Forbes Crail. He had not spoken with her today. Dr. Holt, recovered, subdued, moving through the house with the careful step of a man who has recently been reminded that the ground beneath him is less solid than he had supposed, had reported at lunchtime that she was resting and had asked not to be disturbed. Poirot had respected this. He had, in fact, been grateful for it. He had needed the day to gather what she had set in motion, and she had, with characteristic precision, given him exactly the time required. 20 years. He kept returning to this. 20 years of knowing that her husband was alive. 20 years of managing, that word that Claire had used, that carefully chosen, deliberately opaque word, the situation. Maintaining the estate on the proceeds of a death that had not occurred. Raising, or rather not raising, which was its own form of raising, a daughter she was not permitted to acknowledge. Corresponding through the careful formalities of legal and financial administration with the man who had erased himself and left her to carry the weight of the erasure. What had she been doing in those 20 years? Waiting was the obvious answer. But Poirot did not think Lady Forbes Crail was a woman who waited passively. She was a woman who prepared. There was a difference, a significant difference. The difference between a person who endures time and a person who uses it. She had been building something, the gathering, these 6 guests, this 3-day architecture of revelation, was not improvised. It had been constructed with a deliberateness that Poirot, who had considerable respect for deliberateness, found almost admirable. She had identified every person who held a piece of the puzzle. She had located her daughter. She had made contact, carefully, indirectly, through the formal channels of invitation and instruction. She had poisoned herself at her own dinner table with a compound calibrated to the milligram because she needed the clock started, and she needed everyone in the house to understand that the clock had started. And she had written to Poirot. "Stop me, Poirot." He had been wrong about this. He had understood it incorrectly, or perhaps not incorrectly, but incompletely. He turned the phrase over now in the quiet of his room and saw it differently from every angle, the way a gemstone reveals different colors depending on the light. "Stop me," she had written. But she had written it to him, to Hercule Poirot, who had spent his career not stopping people but understanding them. She did not want a police officer. She did not want a barrister. She did not want a witness in the legal sense. She wanted someone who would understand what she had done and why she had done it, and who would, when it was over, be able to tell the truth about it completely. Every layer of it. Not just the surface crime, not just the legal machinery of a forged death and a stolen identity, but the human truth beneath it. The 20 years. The daughter. The girl in Cairo called Fatima, who had died on a steep staircase and been recorded as an accident while two men wrote letters to each other about the efficient management of inconvenient situations. She wanted Poirot because she trusted him to see all of it. And there was the other possibility. The one he had been circling since the cliff-top conversation with Claire, the one that the phrase "stop me" contained if you held it at a particular angle. What if Lady Forbes Crail was not entirely certain that what she had planned was right? What if, underneath the 20 years of preparation, underneath the implacable patience and the architectural precision of this gathering, there was a woman who was not completely sure, who had written to Poirot not to be witnessed but to be checked, to be told by someone whose judgment she respected whether she had gone too far, whether the justice she was pursuing was still justice, or whether it had, somewhere in those 20 years, shaded into something else. This, Poirot thought, was the most human interpretation, and it was, therefore, almost certainly the correct one. He picked up the photograph from the bedside table and looked at the oval absence. Tomorrow he would look at the face. He slept well, which surprised him. He was eating breakfast alone. The other guests had begun to keep irregular hours, the anxiety of the gathering having disrupted the social rhythms that normally structure a country house stay. When the door opened and George Alderton walked in, or rather, and Poirot made this correction in his mind with the firmness of a man insisting on accuracy. Colonel Ashby Pendleton walked in, except that he was not Colonel Ashby Pendleton either. He was Edmund Forbes Crail. He had always been Edmund Forbes Crail. The colonel was a construction, carefully aged, carefully worn. The military posture and the silver hair and the jaw muscle that twitched with what everyone had taken for the damage of war, but was, Poirot now understood, something else entirely. The involuntary physical expression of a man who has been performing a very demanding role for a very long time and whose body has begun to register the strain of it in ways he cannot fully control. He was 60, close to it. He was. Poirot assessed him with the dispassionate clarity of this new knowledge. A handsome man. Still, the bone structure that had presumably made him striking at 40 remained in the architecture of his face at 60. He held himself well. He moved well. He had constructed George Alderton, and before that, Colonel Pendleton, with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the best disguise is not a costume but a character, and who had the intelligence and the patience to sustain one indefinitely. He was also, Poirot thought, afraid. Not obviously, not in any way that a casual observer would have identified as fear. But Poirot was not a casual observer, and he could see it in the very slight stiffness of the morning's performance, the careful calibration of ordinary behavior, the eyes that moved across the room with a fractionally greater velocity than usual. He knew that something had shifted. He did not know how much. He sat down at the breakfast table with his back to the wall. A habitual positioning, Poirot noted. The positioning of a man who has spent decades ensuring that no one could approach him from behind. And poured himself coffee with a hand that was completely steady. The steadiness of the hand was, to Poirot, the most interesting thing in the room. "Good morning, Monsieur Poirot," he said. The voice was the Colonel's voice, the careful, measured baritone of a military man. "Quiet night." "Very," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "I slept well. The sea air, perhaps. Always helps." He buttered toast with the economic efficiency of a man who has long since stopped tasting his food and eats for fuel. "I imagine you've been doing a great deal of thinking." "It is my primary occupation," Poirot said. "And yours?" A pause so brief that only a person watching specifically for it would have caught it. "Trying not to," he said. And then he smiled. The Colonel's smile, practiced and slight and containing within it, Poirot thought, the shadow of a man who had once been capable of genuine warmth and had decided, at some point, that warmth was an unnecessary vulnerability. They ate in silence for a moment. The silence of two people who are both aware that they are circling something large and have not yet agreed on the moment to approach it directly. It was Forbes Crail who spoke first. "She brought you here to unravel it," he said, conversationally, as though discussing the weather. "Eugenia, that's what this is, isn't it? She's been building to this." "You knew she was aware of you," Poirot said. "That she knew you were alive." "I suspected. For some time." He set down his toast. "Eugenia was never a woman who didn't know things. It was one of her more formidable qualities." Something moved in his voice on this. Something complex enough that Poirot did not try to name it immediately. "I assumed she maintained the arrangement because it suited her. She had the estate, she had the freedom. She was, as far as the world was concerned, a respectable widow of comfortable means. I thought she had made her peace with it." "And yet," Poirot said. "And yet," he looked at the window. The morning outside was pale and clear. The storm of the previous night had passed and left the air washed and cold, the light thin and precise. "She wrote to you?" "Yes." "She wrote to me also," Forbes Crail said. "2 months ago, the invitation. She said," a pause. "She said that she thought it was time we were in the same room again. She said she had some things she wished to say to me and that she preferred to say them with witnesses." His jaw muscle moved. "I should have known then." "Why did you come?" The question sat between them. It was the genuine question, the one that had been forming in Poirot's mind since the moment Claire had told him which guest was which on the cliff-top. Why would a man who had successfully erased himself, who had built an entirely new life on the legal and medical infrastructure of his own fictional death, walk voluntarily into a house that was, as he must have at least suspected, a trap? Forbes Crail looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. "Because she asked me," he said. Poirot said nothing. "I know how that sounds," Forbes Crail continued. His voice had changed, very slightly, but changed. The Colonel had receded somewhat, the way a theatrical performance recedes when the actor forgets, briefly, to maintain it. What remained was harder to categorize. Older, less constructed. "But Eugenia, whatever I have done, whatever you have concluded about the kind of man I am, Eugenia was not a person one ignored. Not when she asked something directly." He looked at Poirot. "In 30 years, she asked me for very little. That was partly my doing. I did not encourage requests. I understand this. But when she asked, it had weight." "The child," Poirot said quietly. "Claire." The name landed. Forbes Crail was very still. "You know about her," he said. "I know a great deal," Poirot said. "I know that she is here. I know that she has known for 3 years that you are alive. I know that she was placed with a woman whose name you chose to borrow when you reinvented yourself. Miss Alderton, I know that this was not coincidence. A long silence. No, Forbes Crail said. It was not coincidence. He looked, for the first time since entering the room, like a man without a performance available to him. Not remorseful. Poirot was careful not to assign remorse where he was not certain it existed, but stripped, the way a face looks when it is not being used to project anything. I chose that name because I wanted to know where she was. I kept the name like a thread, something I could follow back if I chose to. But you did not choose to. No. For 27 years. No. The word landed each time with the flatness of something that has no defense and knows it. Poirot folded his napkin with precise care and placed it on the table. He looked at Edmund Forbes Crail, the real man, the original man. The man whose face had been cut from a photograph by his own daughter who had never met him and had only the shape of his absence to work with. And he felt the thing he sometimes felt at the end of a long investigation when all the pieces were assembled and the truth was finally, fully visible. Not satisfaction. Never quite satisfaction. Something more complicated, the recognition that human beings were capable of extraordinary things. Extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary endurance, and that these two capacities were not always, as one might wish, confined to separate people. He pushed back his chair. This evening, he said, Lady Forbes Crail has asked that everyone gather in the drawing room at 7 o'clock. He paused. I have agreed to facilitate this gathering. I'm asking you now, as I have asked the others, to be present, to listen to what is said, and to consider, between now and then, what kind of ending you wish this to have. Forbes Crail looked at him. And if I chose to simply leave? Take my car and... You will not, Poirot said simply. Because Eugenia asked you here, and because, whatever else you are, you came when she asked. He picked up the briefcase from where he had set it beside his chair. That means something, mon ami. I'm not yet certain what, but it means something. He walked to the door. Behind him, Edmund Forbes Crail sat at the breakfast table with his cold coffee and his carefully constructed silence, and did not leave. Poirot had known he would not. Some things, he had learned, could be predicted with absolute confidence. A man who keeps a name like a thread, in case he should ever choose to follow it home, that man has not entirely surrendered the possibility of home. He has simply been afraid of what he might find there. Tonight, he would find out. 7 o'clock. The drawing room at 7 o'clock held a particular quality of light. It was the light of a room in which candles have been lit, not for atmosphere, but because the lamps are insufficient, and the candles, 3 of them in the tall silver holders on the mantelpiece, cast their warmth in a way that was honest rather than flattering. It showed faces as they were. It showed the lines that years and choices had made in them. It showed, if you knew how to look, the specific geography of what each person in the room had been carrying and for how long. Poirot stood near the fireplace. He had positioned himself there deliberately. Not in the center of the room, which would have been theatrical, and not at its edge, which would have suggested uncertainty, but slightly to the left of the mantelpiece, where the light was best, and where he could see, without turning his head, every face in the room simultaneously. He had learned this positioning over 30 years of drawing rooms and libraries and parlors in which he had been required to deliver truth to people who had various degrees of readiness to receive it. He was wearing his best suit. This was not vanity. It was respect for the occasion, for the people in the room, for the gravity of what was about to happen. Hercule Poirot had always believed that a man who could not be bothered to dress correctly for the important moments of his life had not fully understood what made them important. They arrived in ones and twos, between 5 minutes to 7 and 7 precisely, with the punctuality of people who have been told that something significant will occur, and have spent the intervening hours in a state of suspended, effortful calm. Mrs. Dorothea Plum came first, settling into the armchair nearest the fire with the practiced ease of a woman who always claims the most comfortable seat in any room she enters as a matter of simple competence. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Poirot with her sharp brown eyes and said nothing, which was, he reflected, the most interesting thing she had done in 3 days. Felix Crane came next, without the briefcase. This was significant. He sat on the small sofa near the window and placed his hands on his knees and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has made a decision he cannot yet fully evaluate and is waiting for the evaluation to become possible. Vivian Cross arrived wearing a different dress from the previous evenings. Darker, simpler, with no jewelry except a single thin bracelet on her right wrist, which left her left wrist bare for the first time since Poirot had observed her. The scar was visible in the candlelight. Old, deliberate, a pale ridge of healed skin running along the inner wrist in a pattern that was not accidental and not, Poirot now understood, self-inflicted. It was a burn. It had a specific shape, the shape made by a metal clasp, pressed and held. The shape of a restraint. She sat beside Crane and looked at Poirot with the hollow eyes and said, with a composure that cost her something visible, "Shall I close the door?" "Please," Poirot said. Dr. Holt came in as she was closing it, pale, moving carefully, the bruise at his temple a dark comma at the edge of his face. He chose a chair at the back of the room, slightly apart from the others, and sat in it with the posture of a man who has decided to be present but reserves his rights regarding participation. Claire, still in the dark habit, because she had no other clothes at Ashworth Manor, and because Poirot suspected she had decided that this was not the moment to resolve the question of what she wore, came last among the guests. She stood near the door for a moment, taking in the room, and then moved to a position near the window, not adjacent to any of the others, not isolated, but placed with the careful self-sufficiency of someone who has spent a long time managing their own company and has become very good at it. Her eyes found Poirot's and stayed there for a moment. He gave a very small nod. She looked away. Then the door opened once more. Lady Eugenia Forbes Crail came in. She was dressed in black. Not mourning black, not dramatic black, but the black of a woman who has decided to be unambiguous this evening. Her hair was immaculate. Her posture was the posture Poirot had observed since the first moment, that quality of height achieved through will rather than inches. She moved without haste across the room, and she did not look, as she crossed it, at the man sitting in the high-backed chair to the left of the fireplace. Edmund Forbes Crail, who had come, as Poirot had known he would come, who sat now with his military posture and his silver hair and his carefully neutral expression, watching his wife cross the room with the eyes of a man watching something he has not seen in 20 years and finds, contrary perhaps to his expectations, that he is not prepared for. Lady Forbes Crail sat down in the chair Poirot had placed for her, facing the room, facing all of them, and folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Poirot. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "It is not yet finished," Poirot said gently, "but we are nearly there." He turned to face the room. 7 faces, 7 sets of eyes. The fire behind him and the candles on the mantelpiece and the sound of the sea beyond the windows doing its ancient, indifferent work. "I'm going to tell you," Poirot said, "what I know. Not all of it. You know most of it already, each of you, in your separate portions. What I am going to do is put the portions together, so that what has been assembled in pieces in this house over 3 days becomes at last a complete thing that can be seen entire. I ask only that you listen without interruption. There will be time afterward for whatever each of you needs to say." He paused. No one spoke. 3 weeks ago," he said, "I received a letter, unsigned, 3 words. You have all heard of this letter. or most of you have. What you may not know is that I understood it incorrectly. At first, I took it for a plea. Someone on the edge of a terrible action, asking to be stopped. I came to Ashworth Manor believing I was here to prevent something. He let this sit for a moment. I was wrong, he said. Or rather, I was not wrong, but I was incomplete. The letter was not a plea to be prevented. It was an invitation to witness. An invitation issued by a woman who had spent 20 years constructing a very particular kind of justice and who wished, at the moment of its completion, for someone present who could see it whole, who could see not only the crime but the cost of it, not only the guilty man but every person whose life had been shaped by his choices. He looked at Lady Forbes Crail. She wrote stop me because she was not entirely certain, even now, that what she was doing was right. She wanted someone present who was capable of stopping her if it was not. This is, I think, the most honest thing anyone in this room has done. Lady Forbes Crail looked at him steadily. Her hands in her lap were perfectly still. The man who was known in this gathering as Colonel Ashby Pendleton, Poirot continued, turning his gaze to Forbes Crail, is Edmund Forbes Crail, the legal husband of Lady Eugenia Forbes Crail, a man who arranged his own death, documented by Dr. Holt, who was then a young physician with significant debt and insufficient moral resolution, and provided the legal framework for that fictional death through the offices of Mr. Felix Crane, who was then a junior solicitor in the same condition. He paused. Both men were young. Both men were frightened. Both men have spent 7 years, or 17, in the doctor's case, understanding fully what they did and finding no adequate way to undo it. He looked at Holt, then at Crane. Neither of them looked away. Edmund Forbes Crail disappeared because he needed to, Poirot continued. Not from debt alone, though there was debt. Not from the law alone, though the law had reason to interest itself in him. He disappeared because he had done something in Cairo in 1917 that could not survive scrutiny. In that year, a young woman named Fatima, a servant, 16 years old, employed in a household where Forbes Crail and other men were stationed, discovered something she should not have discovered. She died on a steep staircase. It was recorded as an accident. Colonel Ashby Pendleton, the real Colonel Pendleton, the man currently upstairs in his room recovering from the injury that prevented him from being present this evening. A small movement in the room, surprise, quickly suppressed, was present in that household. He did not act. He has carried this knowledge for 17 years. He was invited here by Lady Forbes Crail because his testimony, his direct witnessing of what occurred, is a necessary component of the complete account. Poirot paused. He is upstairs because he was pushed down the cellar stairs yesterday morning by a person who knew that his testimony, if given to me, would be the final piece. That person, he looked at Forbes Crail, made a calculation that silencing one witness would be sufficient to prevent the account from becoming complete. It was not a correct calculation. Forbes Crail said nothing. His face had changed. The colonel had entirely departed, not with drama, not with sudden revelation, but with the gradual, inevitable recession of something that can no longer be maintained. What remained was the face of a man of 60 who was very tired and very exposed, and who was looking, for the first time in a very long time, at a room full of people who knew exactly who he was. Miss Vivienne Cross, Poirot said, turning, was present at the Cairo household as a child. She was 11 years old. She was the daughter of the English housekeeper. She saw what happened to Fatima, and she was told, explicitly by Edmund Forbes Crail himself, who was present on both occasions, that if she spoke of it, she would be hurt. The scar on her left wrist is the proof of the initial demonstration of this promise. His voice remained even. She has spent 23 years being an actress, which is, I think, not an accidental choice for a woman who learned very young that survival required the performance of emotions she did not feel and the concealment of knowledge she was not permitted to possess. Vivian Cross looked at him with her hollow eyes, and then, slowly, with the exhausted dignity of someone removing a costume they have worn for too long, she nodded. Lady Forbes Crail knew all of this, Poirot said. She had been gathering it, assembling it, piece by careful piece, for 20 years. She knew about Cairo. She knew about the forged death. She knew about her daughter, whom she was not permitted to raise and whom she never stopped thinking of as her daughter. He looked at Claire. She found Miss Cross 3 years ago. She located Dr. Holt. She made contact with Mr. Crane. She traced the real Colonel Pendleton, and she wrote to her daughter and asked her to come. Claire was looking at her mother. Lady Forbes Crail was looking at her daughter. This exchange was the most private thing in the room. Poirot moved past it with deliberate delicacy, the way one moves past something that belongs to other people. "Mrs. Dorothea Plum," he said. Mrs. Plum looked at him alertly. "Is not a housekeeper," Poirot said. "She is a retired clerk of the Dorset Constabulary, retained by Lady Forbes Crail to be present at this gathering in an official or semi-official's capacity. She has been taking very precise mental notes for 3 days. I suspect her recall, if requested, will be comprehensive." Mrs. Plum smiled her wide, cheerful smile. "Perfectly comprehensive," she said, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose skills have been correctly identified. Every word. A silence. Then Poirot turned to the center of the room and addressed directly and finally, "Edmund Forbes Crail." "You came here," Poirot said quietly. "When your wife asked you, you did not have to come. You chose to. This does not erase what you have done. Nothing erases what you have done. But I asked you this morning to consider, between then and now, what kind of ending you wished this to have. I'm asking you again, in front of these witnesses, in front of the woman who has waited 20 years, and in front of the daughter you kept a name for like a thread you might follow home." He paused. "What kind of man do you wish to be at the end of this evening?" The fire crackled. The candles burned. The sea pressed against the cliff with its ancient, patient rhythm. Edmund Forbes Crail looked at his wife. Lady Forbes Crail looked back at him with her deep water-green eyes, and said nothing, and waited. And in the waiting, in the quality of her stillness, the 20-year patience of it, the extraordinary costly endurance of a woman who had decided that she would see this through to its right end and had held to that decision through everything, Poirot saw, for the first time completely, what the letter had meant. "Stop me, Poirot. Stop me if I have become, in my long wait, something other than just. Stop me if what I have built is revenge dressed as reckoning. Stop me if I am wrong." He did not think she was wrong. He thought she had been right for 20 years at considerable personal expense, and that this evening was the evidence of it. Forbes Crail looked down at his hands. Then he looked up. "I would like," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man without a performance available, "to speak to the constabulary." A pause. "And before that," his eyes moved with difficulty to the young woman in the dark habit near the window, "I would like 5 minutes, if she is willing." The room was very quiet. Claire looked at him for a long moment with her mother's eyes. 10, she said. "You can have 10 minutes." What the guilty choose? They gave him the library. It was Poirot who suggested it. The library, with its real books and its lived-in warmth and its quality of having absorbed human thought for a long time. It seemed, to him, the right room for a conversation of this particular kind. Not the drawing-room, which had just held a gathering of witnesses and still carried the charged atmosphere of that. Not the bedroom, which was too private. Not the garden, which was too exposed. The library, where a man might sit among the accumulated evidence of other people's thinking and find, if he was lucky, some clarity about his own. Claire went in first. She stood near the bookshelves with her arms at her sides and her face composed in the expression of someone who has prepared extensively for a moment and is now discovering that preparation only takes you so far. The rest you must manage in real time, with the actual person in the actual room, which is always different from the imagined person in the imagined room you have rehearsed against. Forbes Crail came in after her and closed the door. Poirot did not stay to listen. This was not his conversation. He had learned, over a long career, the precise location of the boundary between what was his and what belonged to other people, and he respected that boundary with the same scrupulous attention he gave to evidence. Some things were not his to witness. He stood in the corridor outside and listened instead to the house. Ashworth Manor had changed its quality of silence over 3 days. When Poirot had arrived, was it only 3 days ago? It felt both longer and shorter, the way time always feels when it is dense with event. The house had held its silence like a secret. Tight. Compressed. The silence of something that has been holding its breath for a very long time and has become accustomed to the effort. Now the silence was different. Looser, somehow. Not resolved. Nothing was yet fully resolved, but decompressed, as though the house had finally, tentatively, begun to exhale. He walked slowly back to the drawing room, where the others were still assembled. The fire had burned lower. Someone, Mrs. Plum almost certainly, had refilled the coffee service on the side table because Mrs. Plum was constitutionally incapable of being in a room where practical comfort could be improved without improving it. Poirot accepted a cup with genuine gratitude and stood near the window. The room had rearranged itself emotionally while he was gone. This happened, in his experience, when the central tension of a gathering was released, so partially released. The individual people, freed from the collective performance of the preceding hours, became visible again as themselves. Their separate exhaustions and their separate reliefs and their separate complications emerged like furniture, re-emerging after a dust sheet has been removed. Vivian Cross was sitting with her left arm resting on the arm of her chair, the scarred wrist turned upward in the candlelight. Not displayed, not performatively exposed, simply no longer hidden. There was a difference. She was looking at the fire with the expression of a woman who has set down something very heavy and has not yet decided how she feels about the lightness. Felix Crane had his head back against the sofa and his eyes closed. He was not asleep. He was simply occupying a moment of stillness with his whole body, which is what people do when they have been tense for a very long time and the tension has, at last, been given permission to release. Doctor. Holt sat in his chair at the back of the room with his coffee and his bruised temple and his particular quality of contained guilt. A guilt that was not simple, not melodramatic, but the complicated, long-marinated guilt of a man who had made one significant moral failure at 26 and had spent the decades since in the ambiguous position of a person who cannot undo what he has done but can no longer pretend it has no weight. Lady Forbes Crail had not moved. She sat in her chair with her hands folded and her posture immaculate, and her expression, Poirot studied it carefully, the expression of a woman in a specific state that he had observed before in people who had spent very long periods working towards something and had now arrived at it. Not happiness, precisely. Not relief, precisely. Something more complex and more honest than either. The feeling, perhaps, of a door that has finally opened after 20 years of pushing, and the discovery that the room beyond it is real and not merely imagined, and that you are actually in it, and that this is actually happening. Poirot sat down. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The fire made its small sounds. The coffee was drunk. The candles on the mantelpiece burned with the steady, democratic warmth of things that do not choose between the innocent and the guilty, but simply illuminate whoever is present. It was Lady Forbes Crail who broke the silence. "I want to say something," she said. To the room, if I may." "Of course," Poirot said. She looked at Dr. Holt first, then at Felix Crane, who had opened his eyes at the sound of her voice, then at Vivienne Cross. "I know," she said carefully, "that I assembled you here without your full understanding of what you were coming to. I know that this was a manipulation of a kind. I want to acknowledge that. I'm not certain it was avoidable. But I am aware of what it cost each of you to be here, and I do not take that lightly." A pause. "Vivienne." The name was spoken with a particular directness, the directness of a woman who has thought very carefully about each word she is about to use. "What was done to you? What was done to a child? I have known about for 8 years. I'm sorry that knowing it did not translate, for 8 years, into action. I told myself I was waiting until the circumstances were right. I have wondered, since, how much of that was strategy and how much of it was fear. Of what the truth would cost." She held the actress's gaze steadily. "I do not ask you to accept this. I ask only that you know it was said." Vivienne Cross looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Not the performance, not the armor, but something underneath both of those. Something younger and considerably less defended. "I came when you wrote," she said at last. "That was my answer." Lady Forbes Crail nodded. Precisely once. She looked at Holt. "Dr. Holt, you signed a document that was false. You were young and you were afraid, and the man who asked it of you was very skilled at identifying the specific fear of specific people and pressing it precisely. This does not absolve you, but it is the truth. And I think you have been living inside a version of this truth for long enough to deserve to hear it stated plainly by someone other than yourself." Holt looked at her with his pale, careful face. "I pushed him," he said quietly. "Forbes Crail. Yesterday. The cellar stairs." He said it flatly, the way people state facts that they know will have consequences and have decided they are no longer willing to carry the fact in secret more than they fear the consequence. "He told me last night, in the corridor after midnight, that he was going to leave, that he was going to take his car before morning, that if I valued my own freedom I would let him go and say nothing." A pause. "I followed him to the cellar stairs. I lost my temper, which is not a justification. He fell. It was more than I intended. I have told myself since that it was less than he deserved, which is also not a justification. The room received this. The Colonel," Poirot said, "is recovering well. He will have a headache for several days." He looked at Holt. "This matter will need to be addressed, Doctor. You understand this?" "Yes," Holt said. "I understand." Mrs. Plum, from her armchair, continued to say nothing and remember everything. The door of the drawing-room opened. Claire came in first. She crossed the room and sat, for the first time since arriving at Ashworth Manor, in the chair nearest her mother's. Not touching, not yet, but near. The distance between them was perhaps 18 inches, which was, after 27 years, a revolution. Lady Forbes Crail looked at her daughter with the deep-water green eyes, and did not speak. She did not, Poirot observed, need to. The looking was enough. The looking was, in fact, enormous. Enormous and entirely private, despite occurring in a room full of people, because some exchanges are private regardless of where they occur. Edmund Forbes Crail stood in the doorway. He looked different. Not transformed, not redeemed in the cinematic sense that would require a different kind of story from this one, but altered in the specific way that a person is altered when they have said something truthful to another person, and the saying of it has cost them something real, and they are now standing in the aftermath of that cost, which is always more complicated than you expect. He looked at Poirot. "I'll speak with the constabulary," he said. "Tonight, if they can be reached. I want this done." I want to stop. He paused on this word, and something briefly illuminated in his face, a flicker of recognition. I want to stop performing, he said. I am very tired of the performance. Poirot looked at him for a moment. Monsieur, he said, you have made, in your life, choices of considerable, he selected the word with care, magnitude. The consequences of those choices will now be determined by people and processes beyond my involvement. I am not a judge. I do not dispense mercy, and I do not dispense punishment. He paused, I only try to see clearly and tell the truth of what I see. Forbes Crail nodded. I know, he said. It's why she wrote to you. He moved to the chair in the corner, the furthest chair at the edge of the room, and sat down. Mrs. Plum rose from her armchair with the purposeful composure of a woman who has been waiting for precisely this moment and had estimated its arrival correctly. She produced, from the small bag she carried, a notebook and a pencil. She looked at Poirot. Shall I? She said. Please, Poirot said. Begin with the Cairo correspondence. Mr. Crane will provide the documents. We will take the statements in order. He looked around the room. We will take as long as is needed, and we will be accurate, completely, entirely accurate. No one in this room owes anyone a convenient version of events. The convenient versions have done sufficient damage. No one disagreed. Outside, the October night pressed against the windows of Ashworth Manor, and the sea went on doing what it had always done. Rolling in, rolling out, laying bare the rocks at the base of the cliff with each recession, covering them again with each return. Patient, iterative, indifferent to the particular human drama conducted at its edge, as it had been indifferent to all the human dramas conducted at all the edges it had witnessed for longer than any of the present troubles and any of the present people. But the dramas mattered anyway. That was the thing Poirot had understood. Across 30 years, in a great many drawing rooms and a great many truths, delivered to people who had various degrees of readiness to receive them. The sea's indifference did not diminish the importance of what happened in houses above it. If anything, the contrast clarified it. The smallness of human lives against the scale of time and water was not a reason to dismiss those lives. It was a reason to take them more seriously. Every choice mattered, every cruelty left a mark, every silence that could have been speech and wasn't. That silence had a cost, and the cost was paid by someone, always, even when the person who had chosen silence believed they had escaped the ledger. You did not escape the ledger, you only postponed its presentation. He sipped his coffee. He listened to Mrs. Plum's pencil moving steadily across her notebook. He looked at the room, at its exhausted, complicated, variously guilty and variously courageous occupants. And he felt the thing he sometimes felt at the end, when the truth had finally been fully assembled and the people responsible for it were sitting in its presence. Not triumph. He had told Hastings once that he did not feel triumphant at these moments, and Hastings, good, warm, perpetually slightly confused Hastings, had looked at him with genuine puzzlement and asked what he felt instead. He had not answered then. He thought now that the honest answer was this. He felt the weight of it, the weight of what truth costs and what silence costs, and the fact that the two costs are not equal, but both are real. He felt the weight of a girl named Fatima on a steep staircase in Cairo in 1917, and a child placed with a brisk woman in Wiltshire and left there for 27 years, and a young actress taught that silence was the price of safety, and a young physician who had signed his name to a lie and carried it into his 50s. He felt the weight of all of it. And underneath the weight, very quiet, very small, but present, something else. The fact that they were here. The fact that the truth was being written down, accurately and completely, in a notebook on the lap of a retired constabulary clerk, in a drawing room above the October sea. The fact that a daughter was sitting 18 inches from her mother for the first time. The fact that a man who had spent 30 years performing was sitting in a corner chair, performing nothing. It was not resolution, it was not redemption, it was not the clean, satisfying closure of a story that knew how to end. It was something real and complicated and earned at considerable cost. Sometimes, he thought, that was enough. Day 3 was nearly over. Tomorrow the constabulary would come. Tomorrow the documents would be submitted and the statements formalized, and the machinery of consequence would begin its slow, impersonal work. Tomorrow Felix Crane would speak to his own solicitor, and Dr. Holt would write a letter to the medical board, and Vivian Cross would perhaps be able to appear in public with her left wrist uncovered. Tomorrow, Claire and Eugenia Forbes-Crail would have a conversation that was not conducted through the carefully formal channels of letters and invitations, and an elaborate Gothic gathering on the Dorset coast. Tomorrow was full of difficult things, but tonight, just tonight, the truth was in the room, and that was where it had needed to be. The train back to London. The constabulary arrived at 9 o'clock the following morning. They came in 2 motor cars, 3 officers from the local Dorset force, accompanied by a detective inspector from Exeter, who had been reached by telephone the previous evening and who arrived with the slightly ruffled composure of a man who has driven a considerable distance before breakfast and has been promised, in exchange, a situation of sufficient complexity to justify it. He was a square, careful man named Fellows, with a dark moustache and the kind of eyes that moved precisely and recorded accurately. Poirot liked him immediately, which was not always the case with official representatives of English law enforcement. He handed Inspector Fellows the briefcase. He did this in the hallway, before the inspector had removed his coat, because he understood that the briefcase was the foundation of everything, and the sooner it was in official hands, the better for everyone present, including those whose presence in official hands was itself imminent. Fellows took it, opened it, looked at the contents for approximately 45 seconds with the expression of a man who had been promised complexity, and found that the promise had been kept. "Right," he said. "I need the rooms." "The library," Poirot suggested. "It is the most comfortable." "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." Fellows looked at him with a slight professional respect that acknowledged without overstating. "I understand you've done a considerable amount of the work." "I have done the assembling," Poirot said modestly. "The work, the real work, was done over 20 years by Lady Forbes-Crail. I would ask that this be remembered when accounts are being prepared." Fellows looked at him steadily. "I'll remember it," he said. The morning proceeded with the particular combination of formal procedure and suppressed emotion that attends the legal processing of events that are simultaneously crimes and human stories. Each person was called to the library in turn. Each person went. The door closed. The voices within were inaudible from the corridor. After a period, varying between 20 minutes and considerably longer, the door opened and the person emerged, looking subtly different in the way that people look different after they have finally said aloud a thing they have been carrying in silence. Edmund Forbes-Crail was in the library for nearly 2 hours. He came out at 11:30 and was escorted to one of the motor cars by 2 officers. He walked without resistance. He walked. Poirot, watching from the hallway, observed this carefully, without the military posture, without the colonel, without any of the constructions that had been serving as his exterior for 30 years. He walked as himself, which was, at this stage of his life, a complicated and rather diminished thing to be. But it was, at least, real. At the door of the motor car, he stopped. He looked back at the house. Lady Forbes-Crail was standing in the doorway. She had come to the door. Poirot had not heard her approach, but there she was. And she was watching with her deep water-green eyes and her immaculate posture and her expression of a woman who has arrived after a very long journey at the place she was walking toward and finds it to be exactly what she expected, and nothing like what she imagined. Forbes Crail looked at her for a moment. He did not speak. She did not speak. There was nothing left between them that speech could improve. He got into the motor car. The door closed. The car moved down the Elm Avenue and turned at the gate and was gone, and Lady Forbes Crail stood in the doorway of Ashworth Manor for a long moment after it had disappeared, looking at the empty drive. Then she turned and went inside. By early afternoon, the house had settled into a different kind of quiet, the quiet of a place from which a long tension has finally departed, leaving behind it a space that has not yet decided what to fill itself with. It was not an unpleasant quiet. It was the quiet of possibility. Vivian Cross left after lunch. She came to find Poirot before she went. A brief visit, conducted in the hallway near the front door, lasting perhaps 4 minutes. "I'm going back to London," she said. "There's a matinee Thursday. I thought I might actually enjoy it this time, for the first time in rather a long while." She looked at him with her hollow eyes, which were, he noticed, very slightly less hollow than they had been 3 days ago, as though something that had been draining them had been stanched. "Will there be a trial?" "There will be proceedings," Poirot said. "Complex ones. The Cairo matter is very old and the evidentiary challenges are considerable. But it will be addressed. I'm confident of this." "Good," she said, simply, without elaboration. Then she held out her hand, and he shook it, and she picked up her case and went out to the car she had arranged, and that was all. Felix Crane left shortly afterward. He looked, Poirot thought, like a man who had been held under water for 7 years and had recently been permitted to surface, stunned by air, not yet certain the surface would hold, but breathing. He had spoken at length with Inspector Fellows. He would speak with his own solicitors in London. His situation was complicated and would remain complicated for some time. But the briefcase was gone from his hands, and the thing that the briefcase had contained was no longer his secret to carry alone. "Monsieur Poirot," he said at the door, "for what it's worth, I knew you were the right person when I saw the letter she wrote to me, the one mentioning your name. I thought, if anyone could see the whole of it clearly, without—" he searched for the word. "Without simplifying it, it would be you." "It is never simple," Poirot said. "It only appears simple from a sufficient distance, and sufficient distance is purchased at great cost to those who are closest to the events." He paused. "Go and speak to your solicitor, Monsieur Crane. Be entirely honest. It is, at this point, the only strategy with any merit." Crane gave him a look that contained, beneath the anxiety and the exhaustion, a fragment of genuine wryness. "That's rather your answer to everything, isn't it?" "It is," Poirot agreed pleasantly, "and it has never once failed to be the correct answer, even when it was the most difficult one." Dr. Holt was the last of the guests to leave, departing in mid-afternoon after a final conversation with Inspector Fellows that extended somewhat longer than the others. He did not seek out Poirot before going. He did leave, however. A sealed envelope on the hall table addressed to Lady Forbes Crail. Poirot noted this without opening it, which was entirely appropriate, as it was not addressed to him. Mrs. Plum shook Poirot's hand with great firmness and produced, from her apparently inexhaustible bag, a card. "If you ever need a person who can remember things precisely," she said, "I am available." She looked at him with her sharp brown eyes. "And if you ever need a person in a room who appears to be merely comfortable, but is in fact attending, I am also available for that." "I know," Poirot said. "You were very good." "I was excellent," Mrs. Plum said without modesty, and went to her car. He found Lady Forbes Crail in the garden, the walled garden, the one from whose gate he had seen the hem of a dark habit disappear round the corner on the second morning. She was walking slowly along the box hedge border, her hands clasped behind her back, her face turned slightly upward toward the thin October sunlight that was doing its best with insufficient resources. She heard him come through the gate and did not startle. She waited until he reached her. They walked together for a moment in silence. The companionable silence of people who have been through something significant together and are not yet ready to reduce it to language. "She is staying," Lady Forbes Crail said at last. "For a few days. Claire." She said the name with the careful, practiced neutrality of someone learning to say a word they have been forbidden for too long and are still slightly afraid of getting wrong. "We have a great deal to— there is a great deal to—" She stopped. "I don't know the right words for what there is." "There are no right words," Poirot said. "There is only the time and the willingness. You have both." She glanced at him. Something moved in the deep-water eyes. "I wrote to you because I needed someone to see it whole, all of it, not just the crime. Anyone can see a crime, but the texture of it, the 20 years, the choices that compound over time until they have weight and shape and consequence." She paused. "I also wrote to you because I was not certain, even after all of it. I was not entirely certain that what I was doing was right." "And now?" Poirot asked. A long pause. The garden wall cut the wind, and the sunlight here was almost warm. "Now I think it was right," she said. "But I think it was only right because of what happened in the drawing room last evening. If it had gone differently, if he had refused, if Claire had refused, if the whole thing had simply been an exposure without the 10 minutes in the library, I think I would not feel certain." She looked at the clipped hedge, winter patient. The evidence was always going to go to the police. The legal matters were always going to be resolved one way or another. That part I was certain of from the beginning. What I was not certain of, what I wrote to you because I was not certain of, was whether there could also be something else, something human in the middle of it. A pause. Whether I was building a reckoning or whether I was building simply a punishment. And I did not want to build only a punishment. I have spent enough time around what punishment looks like when it has no human thing inside it. Poirot walked beside her and said nothing and listened. "You didn't stop me," she said. "No." "Because I was right?" "Because," Poirot said carefully, "you had not gone too far. You were watching yourself. You had invited someone to watch with you. A person who has truly lost the boundary does not write 'stop me.' They do not invite the one person capable of stopping them." He paused. "You were never lost, madame. You were merely in a very dark wood for a very long time. There is a difference." She stopped walking. She stood very still in the thin October sunlight, her hands clasped behind her back, and she looked at the end of the garden where the gate opened onto the cliff path, and beyond it, the sea. "Thank you," she said. Quietly. Entirely without performance. Poirot inclined his head. They stood together for another moment, and then he said gently that his car had been arranged for 4 o'clock, and that he expected he should go and pack his small case. The car came at 4. Poirot descended the steps of Ashworth Manor with his small case and his hat and his overcoat, and he paused on the bottom step and looked back at the house. It looked different from how it had looked 3 days ago. Not changed, not structurally, not architecturally, but different in its quality of presence, the way a face looks different when the person behind it has been relieved of something. It had stopped holding its breath. Claire was standing in the doorway, watching him go. She raised a hand, a small, grave gesture. The wave of someone who is still learning which gestures belonged to her and which ones were borrowed or assigned. He returned it with a small bow that was, he hoped, equal parts respect and encouragement. Lady Forbes Crail was not at the door. She was at the upstairs window, the tall window of what Poirot believed was her private sitting room, standing very still, looking out. He was not certain she could see him from this distance. He raised his hat nonetheless. The drive through the Elm Avenue was familiar now in the way that places become familiar when you have moved through them in difficulty and come out the other side. The trees were the same trees. The crow was not on the gatepost this time, or if it was, it had been replaced by a crow sufficiently similar as to make no practical difference. He was at the train station by 4:30. The London train departed at 5. Hastings was waiting at Victoria. This was not strictly necessary. Poirot had not in fact informed Hastings of his return time, or indeed of his return date. But Hastings had a talent for knowing when Poirot was coming back, which had less to do with supernatural intuition and considerably more to do with the fact that he telephoned the flat twice daily when Poirot was away, and the daily woman had, apparently, mentioned this morning that she had seen the small suitcase restored to its usual position in the wardrobe, which she had dusted the previous day and which had not contained the suitcase at the time. He was standing on the platform with his hat slightly askew and an expression of warm, determined interest, and he fell into step beside Poirot with the ease of long habit. "Well?" he said. Poirot walked for a moment in silence. "Well," he said at last. Was it what you expected?" Poirot considered this with genuine care. "It was more," he said, "and less, as these things always are." He walked another few steps. A man erased himself and called it safety. A woman built the evidence of 20 years and called it justice. A daughter came looking for a face that had been cut from a photograph. He paused. None of them were simply wrong. None of them were simply right. They were human, which is, as always, the most complicated thing anyone can be. Hastings absorbed this in the way Hastings absorbed things, with warm, immediate sympathy and the slight expression of a man who is working slightly harder than he would like to admit. "The man," he said. "Forbes Crail. What do you make of him?" Poirot thought of a man sitting in a corner chair with no performance left to give, a man who had kept a name, Alderton, like a thread he might follow home. "I make of him," Poirot said carefully, "a man who was capable of great cruelty and who was also, in the very last measure, capable of arriving when someone he had wronged most profoundly asked him to arrive. This does not balance the ledger. It does not come close to balancing the ledger." He paused. "But it is not nothing, and I have learned, at some expense of earlier certainty, that refusing to acknowledge the things that are not nothing in a person, simply because the other things are very bad, is its own kind of error." Hastings was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And Poirot, how are you?" It was the question Hastings always asked and always meant, and Poirot was always, in some private way, grateful for it. "I am," he began. He thought about the girl named Fatima, who had died on a staircase in Cairo in 1917, and who had never had a Poirot to assemble the truth about her while it could still be assembled. He thought about Claire, standing in a doorway in a habit that was not hers, waving with a gesture she was still learning. He thought about Lady Forbes Crail at the upstairs window, watching the Elm Avenue, and the quality of her stillness, which was finally, the stillness of a woman who had arrived somewhere and could at last be still without it costing her anything. "I am," he said, "not triumphant." Hastings looked at him. "No," Hastings said gently. "I don't suppose you are." They walked out of Victoria Station into the London evening, grey and damp and full of ordinary people living ordinary lives, none of whom knew what had happened in a house above the Dorset cliffs over 3 days, and none of whom needed to. The truth did not require an audience to be true. It required only that it be seen and said and written down accurately by a woman with sharp eyes and a reliable pencil. The rest, the long, complicated, imperfect rest, belonged to the people who had lived it. A taxicab appeared. Poirot raised his hand. It stopped. Whitehaven Mansions, he told the driver. He settled into the seat. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked out the window at the passing city, lit now against the early dark. The shop fronts yellow and the streets wet and the whole enormous human enterprise proceeding in its familiar, exhausting, irreplaceable way. The truth, he had said to Hastings, on a train once, coming back from somewhere. It is not always a thing to celebrate. Sometimes it is simply a thing to survive. He watched London move past the window. He thought that, on balance, surviving it was enough. He thought that, on balance, it was quite a lot. 3 Days to Confess was written in the tradition of Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot mysteries, with deep admiration for Christie's extraordinary understanding of the human heart, its capacity for cruelty, its capacity for endurance, and the long, complicated distance between the two, for Fatima, and for every person whose name was not recorded.